Hello everyone. Welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind. So, before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you like. Take a deep breath and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1. In 2001, the Yamagami family lived in the quiet town of Sera in Hiroshima Prefecture, a place so safe that people rarely locked their doors. Neighbors, relatives, and acquaintances all described the Yamagamis as friendly, respected, and well-regarded in the community. They led a private, peaceful life, quiet but not isolated. The head of the family was Masahiro Yamagami, 58 years old. He was known for being calm, grounded, and dependable, and he worked for a construction company. The Yamagami family had deep roots in the area and was known for its wealth. Masahiro was the heir to the family property, but years earlier he had eloped with a woman his family disapproved of, resulting in him being disowned. Many years later, after marrying and having a child, he reconciled with his family. Those who knew him described Masahiro as dutiful and level-headed, a man who avoided impulsive decisions and never sought attention. His wife, Junko Yamagami, was 51 years old and also worked at the construction company. She was the same woman Masahiro had once run away with. Junko was organized, reliable, and highly valued at work. Outgoing and well-liked, she had many friends and a warm presence in her community. Their daughter, Chie Yamagami, was 26 and worked as an elementary school teacher. She was starting to build her independent life and was well regarded by her colleagues as responsible and kind. Chie had even represented Sera in a local beauty pageant and appeared on television. She lived alone in an apartment about 30 kilometers from her parents' home, though she visited them often, especially on weekends. At the time of her disappearance, she was engaged. Also living in the household was Masahiro's mother, Mie Yamagami, who was 79 years old. Elderly and largely dependent on her family, she rarely left the house alone. While she maintained friendly relationships with neighbors, her connection with her daughter-in-law Junko had been strained in the past due to earlier events. According to those close to the family, however, that relationship had improved over time. And then there was Leo, the family dog, a constant and loyal presence in the Yamagami household. On the morning of June 4th, 2001, Junko's co-workers were waiting for her at the airport. She was scheduled to depart on a business trip to China. When she failed to arrive, they initially assumed a delay or a simple misunderstanding. But as calls went unanswered and hours passed, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Junko's trips were routine, which only made her absence more alarming. Chie was also missing. The evening before the family disappeared, she had visited a friend. On her way home, she realized she had forgotten some makeup at her parents' house and decided to stop by to retrieve it. Around 9:30 p.m., she left for her parents' home, and that was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. Eventually, concerned relatives were notified, and soon after, the police were contacted. When officers arrived at the Yamagami home, the scene they encountered was eerily calm, more unsettling than any sign of struggle. The front door was locked, but the back door was open. The kitchen light remained on. Breakfast had been prepared, and the beds were neatly made. Junko's packed travel bag for her trip to China was still inside the house, complete with her passport, money, and personal items. Clean clothes were folded beside the made beds, laid out for the next day. Everything suggested the family had stepped out briefly, with the clear intention of returning. Personal belongings were in their usual places, and shoes were neatly lined up in the entryway. What drew particular attention, however, was that 3 sets of pajamas were missing, along with 4 pairs of the family sandals. This suggested the family may have left the house wearing pajamas, a highly unusual act. In Japan, leaving the house in pajamas is considered deeply embarrassing and inappropriate, almost like going out in underwear. For a well-respected and established family like the Yamagamis, this behavior was completely out of character. Equally unusual was the fact that the front door had been locked, a rare practice in that area, and completely out of character for the family. Even more troubling was the disappearance of the family dog, Leo. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, no farewell notes, and no indication of panic or violence. Yet the entire family had vanished. Masahiro's car was missing, while Chie's car remained parked at the house. Masahiro's co-workers later told police that he had not reported to work, and Chie's workplace also confirmed her absence. This was highly unusual for both, as they were known to be responsible and reliable. The police expanded the search, conducting a thorough examination of the house and surrounding fields while questioning neighbors. Helicopters were deployed, and around 50 officers scoured nearby forests, ponds, and rural areas. One neighbor reported hearing a car door slam near the Yamagami home around 10:30 p.m., and a newspaper delivery worker later stated that when he arrived around 4 a.m., Masahiro's car was no longer at the property. This narrowed the likely window of the incident to between 10:30 p.m. on June 3rd and 4 a.m. on June 4th. 2001 relatives, friends, co-workers, and even Chie's fiancé put up missing persons posters and joined search efforts, but nothing was found. Weeks turned into months, and eventually over a year passed with no leads. There were no witnesses, no sightings, and no bank or credit card activity. No one had seen the family anywhere. Then, on September 7th, 2002, the discovery changed everything. A car was found in a water reservoir just 7 kilometers from the family's home. Fully submerged and lying upside down in the water, it was recovered and identified as Masahiro's vehicle. Inside the submerged car were the bodies of Masahiro Yamagami, his wife Junko, their daughter Chie, Masahiro's mother Mia, and the family dog, Leo. There were no external injuries, no signs of violence, and no evidence of a struggle. Masahiro was found in the driver's seat. Because the bodies had been underwater for over a year, the exact cause of death could not be determined. Investigators were also unable to confirm whether drugs or medication had played any role. There was no known history of mental illness among any family members. Some online forums claim that when the car was discovered, a few of the windows were partially open, all occupants were wearing seat belts, and their clothing was heavily damaged, making it unclear whether they had been wearing pajamas. A pair of glasses and an umbrella were reportedly found nearby, though remains unknown if these items belonged to the family. Police ultimately concluded that the car had been deliberately driven into the reservoir, as there were no signs of an accident or external force. This suggests that the final moments did not involve obvious interference by a third party. To this day, there is no definitive explanation for why the Yamagami family left their home that night and never returned. One of the most frequently discussed possibilities is a planned family suicide. Masahiro was behind the wheel. The car appeared to have been intentionally driven into the reservoir, and there were no signs of violence or panic. Yet this theory feels incomplete. There was no farewell note, and the family had no known financial or legal troubles. Junko was scheduled to leave for a business trip the next day, something she had reportedly been looking forward to. Her co-workers described her as happy and excited in the days leading up to her disappearance. It is equally difficult to imagine why Chie would have chosen to end her life. She was happily engaged, had recently begun building an independent life, was well-liked, financially stable, and described as cheerful and full of energy. Her visit to her parents' house that evening seems to have been spontaneous. She only intended to stop by briefly to retrieve some forgotten items. The fact that the family dog, Leo, was also present further complicates this theory, as including a pet would be highly unusual in the context of a planned suicide. Another theory sometimes discussed is that family tensions played a role. Masahiro's elderly mother lived in the household, which may have created emotional or logistical strain. Some speculate about conflicts with extended family members or disputes over responsibilities, property, or inheritance. One Reddit user claimed that Masahiro had a brother with significant debt, and that Masahiro had refused to assume responsibility for it. According to this claim, the brother allegedly moved into the Yamagami home after the family disappeared. There was also speculation about a large life insurance policy, supposedly worth around $2 million, that someone in the family might have inherited. However, this narrative exists only in online discussions and has never been officially confirmed. Others believe the tragedy may have been the result of a sudden accident. According to this theory, the family might have left the house late at night due to an unexpected emergency. The kitchen light left on, the prepared breakfast, and the missing sandals could suggest that they intended to step out briefly. Some speculate that the grandmother, Mia, may have suffered a medical emergency, such as a stroke or heart attack, prompting the family to rush her to the hospital. In the chaos of darkness and urgency, Masahiro could have lost control of the vehicle and driven into the reservoir. However, this explanation also has serious weaknesses. The car appears to have been deliberately driven into the water, and it is unclear why the entire family, including the dog, would have accompanied Masahiro in such an emergency. Additionally, the front door of the house had been locked, a behavior the family reportedly never practiced. The darkest and perhaps most unsettling theory is that Masahiro himself may have initiated an extended family suicide. According to this idea, he could have been carrying a personal burden invisible to those around him. Some online speculation suggests that Junko may have been involved in an affair with her boss or a co-worker, and that Masahiro discovered this shortly before the incident. On the day of the disappearance, Junko was scheduled to travel to China with her colleagues, including her boss, which may have intensified his distress. In this interpretation, Masahiro may have acted out of rage, humiliation, or despair, attempting to prevent the trip from happening altogether. Proponents of this theory suggest that Masahiro may have taken his daughter Chie along to spare her from what he perceived as shame, and his mother Mie as well, perhaps believing she should not be left alone to face the consequences, especially given her dependency and prior disapproval of his marriage. Even the family dog, Leo, may have been brought along as part of a symbolic act of erasing the entire family unit. Some theorists also speculate that financial pressures may have contributed, leaving Masahiro feeling trapped with no apparent way out. Yet, even under this theory, questions remain. How could he have persuaded his family to leave the house late at night, possibly in their pajamas, without revealing his intentions? This theory, while deeply disturbing, is entirely speculative and unsupported by direct evidence. None of it has been confirmed or officially acknowledged by law enforcement. The case of the Yamagami family remains unsolved, for people and a dog lost their lives, and no clear cause or motive has ever been established. To this day, what truly happened on the night of June 3rd, 2001 remains a mystery. Case 2. Let me explain now. Herman W. Mudgett was born on May 16, 1860, in Gilmantown, New Hampshire. He spent most of his childhood living on a farm near Burlington, Vermont. From an early age, he was exceptionally intelligent, ambitious, and devoted to his studies. By the time he was 16 years old, he had already begun working as a schoolteacher. On July 4th, 1878, when he was 18, Mudgett married Clara Lovering in Alton, New Hampshire. Around this period, he resigned from his teaching position in order to enroll in a medical school in Burlington, Vermont. After completing his studies there a year later, he moved on to Ann Arbor College in Michigan to further his medical education. In 1881, Mudgett came into possession of a body that bore a striking resemblance to one of his fellow students, his closest friend, who had recently taken out a life insurance policy worth $1,000, naming Mudgett as the beneficiary. This circumstance sparked an idea between the two students. Secretly, they placed the body in the bed of Mudgett's friend, who then vanished without a trace. Little to no investigation followed the incident. As a result, Mudgett was able to collect the insurance money without difficulty, which he presumably shared with his dead companion. Soon after this event, Mudgett left college and, adopting the name Holmes, secured employment at an insane asylum in Norristown, Pennsylvania. After 6 months, he left the asylum and moved to Philadelphia, where he found work as a drug clerk. He later traveled to Chicago and opened his own drugstore. Continuing to use the name Holmes, he married Miss Myrta Belknap in Chicago on January 28, 1887, an act that constituted bigamy. On January 17, 1894, using the name Howard, he married once again, this time in Denver. The bride was Miss Georgie Yoke of St. Louis, who became another victim. Before marrying Miss Yoke, Holmes traveled extensively across the country under numerous assumed names, engaging in various ventures, none of which could have withstood close scrutiny. During this period, he accumulated a substantial amount of money and constructed a 4-story building at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets in Chicago. This building later became known as the Holmes Castle. Around 1889, Holmes met Benjamin F. Pitzel in Chicago. Pitzel was later suspected of having been Holmes' accomplice in many of his crimes. At that time, Pitzel's family, his wife and 4 young children, Desi, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, were living in St. Louis. Holmes was a man of medium height and build, always immaculate in appearance and smooth in manner. Yet, as this account will demonstrate, Beneath that polished exterior lay a fiendish nature. Pitzel was highly susceptible to mesmerism, and Holmes, possessing strong hypnotic influence, quickly discovered this trait. From that moment on, Pitzel became little more than clay in Holmes' hands. On November 9th, 1893, Pitzel took out a life insurance policy for $10,000 with the Fidelity Mutual Life Association of Philadelphia, naming his wife as the beneficiary. Aware of this policy, Holmes proposed a plan to Pitzel and his wife. He suggested that Pitzel travel to Philadelphia and, under the assumed name of Beef Perry, open an office bearing the sign "Patents Bought and Sold." Holmes claimed that he would then search hospitals or medical colleges to find a body closely resembling Pitzel in both features and physique. This body would be secretly placed in the office and arranged in such a manner that it would clearly appear the victim of an accidental explosion, leaving no cause for suspicion. Pitzel would disappear, and Mrs. Pitzel's 14-year-old daughter, Alice, would go to Philadelphia to identify the remains as those of her father. The insurance money would then be paid without question, after which Pitzel would quietly return to his family. Mrs. Pitzel strongly objected to the scheme, but Holmes ordered Pitzel to comply. As a result, on August 17, 1894, Pitzel opened an office at 1316 Callow Hill Street and displayed the sign exactly as Holmes had instructed. On June 15, 1894, while Holmes, then using the name Howard, was in St. Louis making arrangements for his latest scheme, he purchased a drugstore and placed a mortgage upon it. Shortly afterward, he sold the mortgage property, and on July 19th, he was arrested on charges of obtaining money by false pretenses in connection with the transaction. During his confinement in jail, he became acquainted with Marion Hedgespeth, who, along with 3 others, had robbed a train near St. Louis in 1891 and was later captured in San Francisco. Holmes asked Hedgespeth if he knew of a capable and clever lawyer. The train robber recommended J.D. Howe of St. Louis. Holmes then rashly revealed his entire plan concerning Pitzel to Hedgespeth, promising him a payment of $500 for his assistance if the scheme succeeded. On July 31st, Holmes was released on bail, which was furnished by his third wife. A few days after securing his release, he traveled to Philadelphia, where he met Pitzel, who was operating under the alias Perry. On August 17th, the day Pitzel opened his office on Callow Hill Street, Holmes accompanied him to a second-hand furniture store at 1037 Buttonwood Street and assisted him in selecting furnishings for the office. On August 22nd, a carpenter named Eugene Smith, an inventive man by nature, happened to pass the office. His attention was drawn by the sign, and he entered to discuss the merits of a set saw he had invented and hoped to place on the market. Perry listened with interest and asked Smith to bring a model of the invention the following day. Smith complied, and after examining it, Perry predicted that it would sell well. On Monday, September 3rd, Smith returned to learn how his device was progressing. Perry was not present in the office, but his hat and coat were there. Believing that Perry had merely stepped out briefly, Smith waited for some time before growing impatient and leaving. He returned the next day and again found no one, but noticed that the hat and coat remained exactly as before. Making inquiries in the neighborhood, he learned that Perry had not been seen since Saturday. Growing suspicious, Smith resolved to investigate further. As Perry occupied both floors of the small 2-story building, Smith went upstairs. In a rear room, he discovered the mutilated body of Perry. The chest and one side of the face were badly burned. Nearby lay fragments of a large bottle, along with a tobacco pipe and a burned match. The body was taken to the morgue, where it remained unclaimed until September 13th. After no one came forward to identify it, the remains were finally buried in the Potter's Field. On September 19th, Attorney Howe visited Mrs. Pitzel at her home in St. Louis and informed her that her husband was dead. He requested that her 14-year-old daughter, Alice, accompany him to Philadelphia in order to identify the body. Mrs. Pitzel then signed a document prepared by Howe, granting him power of attorney to collect the insurance money. Howe departed with Alice. Mrs. Pitzel, believing that her daughter would merely be instructed to identify the body of a stranger and that her husband was, in fact, alive and well. On September 21st, Howe, Alice, Holmes, and Eugene Smith, the man who had discovered the body, appeared at the Philadelphia office of the insurance company. After Smith had been questioned, the group proceeded with insurance officials to disinter the remains. Holmes explained that he was a close friend of the Pitzel family and stated that he knew Pitzel had been living at 1316 Callow Hill Street under the assumed name of Perry, owing to financial difficulties in Fort Worth. When the body was uncovered, Both Alice Pitzel and Holmes immediately identified the remains as those of Pitzel. Although the exact cause of death was not entirely clear to the insurance officials, they concluded that the large bottle found broken near the body had likely contained an inflammable substance which exploded while the deceased was in the act of lighting his pipe. This theory, however, was challenged. It was pointed out that the body lay in a peaceful position and that when the stomach was examined, it emitted a distinct odor of chloroform. Nevertheless, the insurance claim was honored. The money was paid to Howe, who returned to St. Louis and delivered the sum of $10,000 to Mrs. Pitzel, after deducting $2,800 for expenses. As Alice did not return with Howe, Mrs. Pitzel anxiously asked about her daughter's whereabouts. The attorney reassured her, stating that Holmes would see to it that Alice was properly cared for. A few days later, Holmes himself visited Mrs. Pitzel, who tearfully pleaded to be taken at once to her husband and child. Holmes told Mrs. Pitzel that she must be patient, as the insurance officials were suspicious of the entire transaction. He insisted that it was advisable for the family to remain separated for the time being. He explained that he had come to collect the two younger children, Nellie and Howard, and take them to Covington, Kentucky, where a kind old lady was caring for Alice. Mrs. Pitzel strongly objected to this plan, but after some argument, Holmes persuaded her to consent to the children being taken away. The monstrous man then produced a note claiming that he and Mr. Pitzel had obtained $16,000 from Attorney Samuels in Fort Worth. According to the note, in order to secure their property there, a portion of the money needed to be forwarded immediately. Using this pretext, Holmes extorted $7,000 from Mrs. Pitzel. After instructing her to proceed to her parents' home in Galva, Illinois, he departed on September 28th with the two children, promising that the entire family would be reunited as soon as possible. At that time, Alice was being cared for by a lady in Covington, Kentucky. At Holmes' request, she wrote a cheerful letter to her mother, describing the kind treatment she was receiving. This reassured Mrs. Pitzel and increased her trust in Holmes, making her less regretful about parting with the other children. Once the letter was sent, Holmes arranged for Alice to meet him and the two other children in Indianapolis, from where they traveled to Cincinnati. He left Cincinnati on October 1st with all three children and proceeded to Indianapolis, placing them in the Circle Hotel. He then met Miss Georgie Yoke and stayed with her at another hotel nearby. Miss Yoke believed herself to be Holmes' lawful wife and was completely unaware of his crimes. Holmes claimed that he was promoting a patent copier, which he expected would make him wealthy, and that his mysterious journeys were connected to this business. He deliberately arranged things so that Miss Yoke never met the children. The following day, Holmes took Alice and Nellie to Detroit, but little Howard had mysteriously disappeared. He wrote to Mrs. Pitzel, asking her to bring Howard and Desi to Detroit so they could meet Mr. Pitzel. Holmes and his wife stayed at one hotel, while the two girls were placed at another. When Mrs. Pitzel arrived, she stopped at Geiss's Hotel, just a short distance from the New Western, where Alice and Nellie were staying under the name Canning, which was their grandparents' surname. Holmes instructed the children to remain in their room. When he met Mrs. Pitzel, he explained that an investigation had been launched and that it was necessary to delay the family reunion. In this instance, Holmes unknowingly spoke the truth. It should be remembered that he had promised Marion Hedgespeth $500 if the insurance fraud succeeded. However, as time passed and Marion received none of the money, he decided to inform the authorities, motivated both by revenge and by a desire to gain favor with those who could assist him. On October 9th, he wrote a letter to Chief of Police Harrigan of St. Louis, revealing the entire scheme, though he did not believe Pitzel was actually dead. On October 18th, Holmes took his wife and Nellie and Alice Pitzel to Toronto, Canada. He and his wife stayed at the Walker House under the name Howell, while the children were registered at the Albion Hotel under the name Canning, just as they had been in Detroit. Mrs. Pitzel was instructed by Holmes to depart on October 19th for Toronto, taking Desi and the baby with her. He told her that, if he deemed it safe, she could there be reunited with the remainder of the family. By this time, the poor woman was nearly driven to insanity by grief, fearing the worst. She asked Holmes to allow her husband to write to her, but he claimed that the authorities might intercept the letters. Holmes visited Mrs. Pitzel in Toronto and told her that it was impossible to reunite the family at that time. He sent her along with Desi and the baby Wharton to Ogdensburg, New York, and from there to Burlington, Vermont. In Burlington, Holmes rented a house at 26 Winooski Avenue, where he had intended to murder the rest of the family. Fortunately, the opportunity did not present itself. After the family left the house, a large bottle of chloroform was discovered in the cellar, left behind by Holmes. The mother began to lose all hope of ever seeing her husband and 3 children again. Eventually, she returned to her relatives in Galva, Illinois. Pleading urgent business, Holmes left Miss Yoke around November 1st and traveled to Gilmantown, where he remained with his legal wife until November 17th, when he departed for Boston. Detectives tracked him from his old home to Boston, where he was arrested on November 19th. During a search of his belongings, several letters written by the Pitzel children to their mother were discovered. Holmes believed that the authorities either suspected him of substituting a body while falsely claiming it was Pitzel's, or wanted him for horse stealing in Texas. Knowing the harsh punishments meted out to horse thieves in Texas, he immediately admitted that he had defrauded the insurance company by swearing that the body found on Callow Hill Street was Pitzel's. In reality, he claimed Pitzel had left the country with his 3 children. Holmes expressed a willingness to return to Philadelphia and plead guilty to the insurance swindle, provided he was not handed over to Texas authorities. In making a statement in which he implicated Mrs. Pitzel as a party to the fraud, she was arrested and brought to Boston along with Desi and the baby. Mrs. Pitzel underwent severe cross-examination, but by its conclusion, the authorities were convinced of her innocence. On November 19th, Mrs. Pitzel and Holmes were taken to Philadelphia as prisoners, accompanied by the 2 children and Miss Yoke. It was not until June 3rd, 1895, that Holmes was brought to trial for defrauding the insurance company. He willingly pleaded guilty to BY this time. Several months had passed since anyone had heard from Pitzel or his 3 children, and authorities were becoming convinced that Holmes was guilty of far graver crimes than merely defrauding an insurance company through a substituted body. They strongly suspected him of at least 4 murders. As Pitzel was believed to possess intimate knowledge of Holmes' criminal activities, it was clear that Holmes' desire to permanently silence Pitzel was rivaled only by his greed for the bulk of his life insurance. Mrs. Pitzel would eventually come to realize this, and if her husband was not returned, she would inform the authorities. This, in turn, would prompt a closer examination of the body in the potter's field, likely resulting in Holmes being charged with Pitzel's murder. The older children were likely informed by their mother about the insurance swindle and were reassured that their father would return. Naturally, children talk, and the officers assumed that Holmes understood this. They concluded that he would only feel safe once the entire family was disposed of. He could not hope to murder 6 people at once without being detected, so he decided to separate them and kill them individually. On December 27th, 1894, Holmes made another statement, substantially as follows. I regret that I have made false statements in the past, but the following are the facts. While Pitzel was at 1316 Callow Hill Street, he drank heavily, and I took him to task about it. He appeared despondent and said he would rather drink enough to kill himself and be done with it all. The next morning, I visited his place and, using a key, entered the building. I found a letter addressed to me, which I destroyed, in which he stated I would find his body upstairs. I went upstairs and found him lying dead on the floor. A rubber tube was in his mouth, attached to a quill that ran through a cork in a large bottle containing chloroform. I had previously arranged with Pitzel that the body substituted for his should have its face and hands burned by pouring a mixture of benzene, chloroform, and ammonia on it, and then setting it on fire. A large bottle was to be broken, and a smoking pipe and burn match placed nearby. The purpose was to make it appear that the person, supposed to be Pitzel or Perry, had ignited the mixture in the bottle while lighting the pipe, causing the explosion that resulted in death. Seeing Pitzel's body, I decided to carry out this plan in all its details. The 3 children are now in Europe, in the custody of Miss Minnie Williams, formerly of Fort Worth, Texas. It was easily proven that Holmes had told the truth regarding the identity of the dead man found on Callow Hill Street, but the remainder of his statement was not believed. It was now clear that Holmes was not guilty of substituting a body, and action regarding that charge was postponed pending a further search for the missing children. The district attorney then sought a detective with sufficient skill and determination to undertake this monumental task, and ultimately selected Frank Geyer of the Philadelphia Police Department. As 8 months had passed since the children were last seen, and as it was likely that anyone who had seen them had already forgotten their faces, the challenges facing the officer seemed nearly insurmountable. On June 26, 1895, Geyer set out with photographs of Holmes and the three children. He first traveled to Cincinnati, where he began visiting the city's hotels. At the Hotel Bristol, located at 6th and Vine Streets, the clerk identified the pictures as those of a man and three children who had registered under the name Cook. Believing that Holmes had likely murdered the children in a suburban house, Geyer canvassed real estate offices both in the city and its outskirts. At the office of J.C. Thomas at 15 East 3rd Street, the clerk recognized the photographs of Holmes and Howard Pitzel and revealed that Holmes had rented a house at 305 Poplar Street, where he stayed only 2 days. Geyer visited the property and spoke with a Miss Hill, who lived next door. She recalled seeing Holmes move a massive stove into the house, but no furniture. The unusual incident so impressed her that she unconsciously observed his movements very closely. Holmes, noticing her attention, altered his plans. Before leaving the house with Howard, however, he offered the stove to the inquisitive neighbor. Geyer then traveled to Indianapolis, where he visited hotels and real estate offices. He gathered valuable information about the route the children had taken from letters they had written to their mother, which Holmes had kept in his possession and withheld. At this time, Geyer located Mr. Herman Acolo, who immediately identified the photographs of the children as guests who had stayed at a Circle House. He reported that the children had been confined to their room almost like prisoners and, though constantly crying, refused to explain their distress. A letter written by Alice to her mother shortly after leaving Indianapolis, which was found in Holmes' pocket when he was arrested, contained the innocent remark that Howard, her brother, is not with us now. This led Geyer to conclude that the child had likely been murdered in or near Indianapolis, although he could not obtain any concrete leads at that time. The detective next investigated Holmes Castle in Chicago, but found no information there regarding the Pitzel children. He then went to Detroit, where he discovered that on October 12th, Nellie and Alice Pitzel had been registered at the New Western Hotel, though neither Howard nor his trunk was ever seen there. Suspecting that Holmes might have taken Howard in the trunk with him, Geyer set out to trace Holmes' movements. He discovered that Holmes and Miss Yoke had registered as G. Howell and wife at the Hotel Normandy. Since neither the boy nor the trunk had been seen there, the detective became even more convinced that little Howard had met his fate elsewhere. Determined to locate the girls first, Geyer proceeded to Toronto, Canada, where Mrs. Pitzel had next encountered Holmes. Geyer arrived on Monday, July 8th, and found that on October 18, 1894, Holmes and Miss Yoke had registered at the Walker House under the name Howell and wife, while the children were registered at the Albion Hotel under the name Canning. Herbert Jones, a clerk at the Albion, stated that on October 25th, Holmes had collected the children, paid their bill, and they were never seen again. Knowing that Holmes had visited his first wife in Gilmantown a few days later, Geyer became convinced that the fiend had rented a house in Toronto specifically to murder the two girls. He compiled a list of all real estate agents and had newspapers publish the children's photographs along with his theories. He then began canvassing real estate offices, a process that lasted for days without immediate success. Eventually, Geyer learned that a Mrs. Frank Noodle had rented a house at number 16 Vincent Street in October 1894 to a man who stayed only a few days and acted very mysteriously. Geyer immediately went to the property, but when he reached number 18 Vincent Street, he showed the photographs of Holmes and Alice to Mr. Thomas Rives, who lived there. Mr. Rives instantly recognized them as the man and girl who had stayed next door for a single day before disappearing. Mr. Rives also recalled that the man had borrowed a spade from him, claiming he intended to plant potatoes. Armed with this information, Geyer hurried to Mrs. Noodle's home, showing her and her daughter Holmes' photograph. He asked if they had seen the man before. Both immediately confirmed that he was the person who had rented their Vincent Street property. Geyer's excitement was boundless. He rushed back to number 18 Vincent Street, borrowed the same shovel Holmes had used, and proceeded to the next house, number 16, which was then occupied by a family named Armbrust. After quickly explaining the purpose of his mission, the lady told Geyer to proceed with his investigation. He carefully examined the house, and upon lifting the linoleum in the kitchen, he discovered a trap door leading to a dark cellar. Geyer procured a light and, after inspecting the ground, found a spot that appeared to have been recently disturbed. He had only been digging for a minute or two when a terrible odor arose, growing more horrible with each shovelful of dirt removed. He eventually unearthed what appeared to be the arm of a child. As the flesh began to fall from the bones, he realized that extreme caution would be necessary or the bodies might disintegrate. Undertaker Humphreys was called in, and digging continued, ultimately revealing the horribly decomposed bodies of Nellie and Alice Pitzel. While the children's features were unrecognizable, their clothing and hair were readily identified by their heartbroken mother, who immediately set out for Toronto upon learning of the discovery. To further confirm the identification, Geyer located a family named McDonald who had moved into the house after Holmes left. They found a wooden egg which, when split in the middle, released a small snake. Mrs. Pitzel recognized this as a toy she had purchased for her daughters. The bodies were entirely nude when found, and the clothing mentioned above had been removed by Holmes. He had stuffed the garments up the parlor chimney along with some straw and attempted to set them on fire. When the clothes failed to burn, the chimney remained clogged, and Mrs. Armbrust, upon inspecting it, discovered the garments and fortunately did not dispose of them. It goes without saying that Holmes' purpose in removing and attempting to destroy the clothing was to prevent the bodies from being identified. On July 19th, after the burial of the Pitzel children in Toronto, Geyer traveled to Detroit, where he learned that Holmes had rented a house at 241 East Forest Avenue. Investigations revealed that he had dug a grave in the cellar, but before he could complete his work, he was informed that detectives were on his trail, and he abandoned his plans for the time being. Geyer left Detroit on July 23rd and returned to Indianapolis to continue the search for little Howard Pitzel's body. For days on end, Geyer tirelessly canvassed the real estate offices both within Indianapolis and in the surrounding suburbs. On August 1st, he traveled to Chicago, where a child's skeleton had been discovered at Holmes Castle. However, Geyer soon became convinced that the remains belonged to another unfortunate child, and after a few days he returned to Indianapolis. The search now extended to every small town within several miles of the city. After nearly a month of exhaustive work, only the quaint town of Irvington, about 6 miles from Indianapolis, remained unsearched. Weary but determined, Geyer made his way to the real estate office of an elderly man named Brown. After relating his story and showing his photographs hundreds of times over several weeks of fruitless labor, Geyer once more recounted the details and displayed the pictures of Holmes. Adjusting his glasses, the old man finally remarked that the photograph was of a man who had rented a house from him in October 1894. Since the house belonged to a Dr. Thompson, who had seen the tenant, Geyer hurried to him. The doctor not only confirmed that the photograph depicted his tenant, but also informed Geyer that a boy named Elvit Mormon, employed at the house, had seen this man with a boy. When interviewed, Elvit immediately identified the photographs of Holmes and little Howard. He explained that his duties required him to milk a cow every afternoon in a lot behind the house Holmes had rented. While he was engaged in this task, Holmes had asked him to help put up a stove after he finished milking. The boy complied and, while assisting Holmes, asked why he did not use a gas stove instead of a coal stove. Holmes replied that gas was not healthy for children. Little Howard had been present when Holmes made this remark. Geyer then proceeded to the vacant cottage across the street from a Methodist church. He searched the house from cellar to roof, but discovered nothing. Examining the lattice work between the piazza floor and the ground, he spotted pieces of an old trunk. Breaking in, he found remnants of the trunk with a piece of blue calico pasted over it, marked with the figure of a flower. Though the earth appeared disturbed, Geyer's digging proved fruitless. He then examined the barn, where he found a massive coal stove. As night fell, Geyer paused his search, intending to resume in the morning. At the time, Mrs. Pitzel was with her relatives in Galva, Illinois, and Geyer sent a telegram asking, "Did missing trunk have blue calico with white flower over seam on bottom?" The reply came, "Yes." After Geyer left the cottage, 2 boys, Walter Jenny and Oscar Kettenbach, aware of his mission, decided to play detective. While exploring the cottage, they ran their hands into a stovepipe hole in the basement chimney and brought out a handful of ashes. Hidden among the ashes were several teeth and small pieces of bone. While still in the Irvington Telegraph office, Geyer was informed of this discovery and immediately returned to the cottage. Procuring a hammer and chisel, he tore down the lower part of the chimney, uncovering nearly a full set of child's teeth, several fragments of human bone, and a large shard mass identified as portions of a child's stomach, liver, and spleen baked hard. A corner grocer then came forward, reporting that the boy whose photograph Geyer had shown him had visited his store in October, left his coat there, and promised to return for it, but never did. Mrs. Pitzel was once again sent for, and upon careful examination, she positively identified the coat as one that belonged to her young son, Howard. Following this identification, Detective Geyer succeeded in locating Albert Schiffling, who conducted a shop at 48 Virginia Avenue in Indianapolis. Schiffling stated that on October 3rd, Holmes had visited his shop accompanied by little Howard, and during this visit Holmes left several surgical instruments to be sharpened. The unfortunate child, innocent of his impending fate, could not have imagined that these very instruments were being prepared for the purpose of dismembering his body, so that it might afterward be cremated in the stove Holmes had arranged to have set up. After hearing all the testimony and carefully reviewing the evidence presented, the coroner's jury did not hesitate in rendering a verdict declaring that Howard Pitzel had been murdered by Holmes. On September 1st, 1895, Detective Geyer returned to Philadelphia, where he was met with congratulations from all sides for having successfully unraveled one of the greatest and most perplexing mysteries in the criminal history of America. Without delay, he devoted himself to the task of bringing the arch-fiend Holmes to justice. Holmes, having already been indicted for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel, was ordered to stand trial, which was set for October 28th. During the time that Detective Geyer was tirelessly engaged in locating the missing members of the Pitzel family and uncovering their tragic fate, authorities in Chicago, Fort Worth, Texas, and numerous other cities were independently investigating Holmes' earlier career and movements prior to the death of Pitzel. When officials finally inspected the notorious structure known as Holmes Castle, located at 63rd and Wallace Streets in Chicago, they were astonished beyond measure at the elaborate and carefully planned arrangements made by this criminal to entrap his victims and dispose of their remains, all while operating in the very heart of a great and populous city. The discoveries within the building revealed a level of deliberate cruelty and calculated deception that shocked even the most experienced officers and investigators. This structure was a 4-story brick building covering a lot approximately 50 by 120 feet. The lower floor was occupied by stores, including a drugstore on the corner. The outer rooms of the 3 upper stories featured square bay windows and were arranged into apartments and offices, with the exception of the section used by Holmes for his human slaughterhouse. Holmes' rooms were on the 2nd floor, and his office contained a vault from which neither air nor sound could escape when the door was closed. From his windowless bathroom, which had no source of light except what could be artificially brought in, a secret stairway led to the basement. To access this stairway, one had to lift the bathroom rug, revealing a trapdoor. Similarly, the laboratory on the 3rd floor was connected to the cellar by another secret passage. There was no other way to reach this particular section of the cellar except via these hidden stairs. In the cellar, a large grate with a removable iron covering concealed a firebox beneath it. An ash pile in the corner contained several small pieces of burned human bone, and in the center of the room stood a long dissecting table, stained with blood and marked with indentures from surgical instruments that on July 24th, 1895, Detectives Fitzpatrick and Norton of the Chicago Police began a systematic search for evidence of Holmes' crimes in the building. They dug up the cellar and discovered, buried in quicklime, 17 ribs, 3 sections of vertebrae, several teeth attached to the upper portion of a jawbone, a decayed and lime-eaten part of a child's cape coat, and a woman's garment thoroughly soaked with blood and brown with age. These items were sent to Dr. C. P. Stingfield, who, after a microscopical examination, confirmed that the stains on the woman's garment were human blood, and that the bones were from children aged approximately 8 to 14. In one of his many statements, Holmes claimed that the Pitzel children had been sent to Europe in the care of a Miss Minnie Williams. This claim prompted an investigation into Miss Williams' identity and eventually led to 2 additional murders being attributed to Holmes. Miss Williams had entered Holmes' employ as a stenographer in 1893, at which time he was head of the so-called Campbell Yates Manufacturing Company, operating from offices in the castle. Learning that she and her sister, Nettie, owned valuable land in Fort Worth, Texas, Holmes professed love to Minnie, and it was said that they lived as man and wife in the castle. Later in 1893, At Holmes' request, Minnie wrote to Nettie that she was about to be married, instructing her sister, a teacher in Fort Worth, to come to Chicago immediately to attend the wedding. Nettie arrived in Chicago shortly afterward, but within a short time, both sisters mysteriously disappeared and were never seen again. In February 1894, Pitzel, using the alias Lyman, traveled from Chicago to Fort Worth and recorded a deed from one bond to Lyman for a valuable piece of land at 2nd and Rush Streets. The bond was supposedly a transfer from Minnie Williams. On this property, Lyman began erecting a building, and shortly thereafter, Holmes, under the alias Pratt, arrived on the scene. Their business dealings soon became tangled, and the pair left town before the building was completed. During this time, Holmes stole a horse and engaged in numerous other shady transactions. On July 19th, 1895, police conducted another search of the castle and discovered more charred bones, several metal buttons, and a fragment of a watch chain. C. E. Davis, who had previously operated a jewelry store in the castle, identified the watch chain as belonging to Minnie Williams, noting that he had repaired it on 2 occasions. He also stated that he had seen Minnie wearing a dress with buttons similar to those found at the scene. On August 4th, Detective Fitzpatrick located Minnie Williams' trunk in janitor Pat Quinlan's room in the castle. An obvious, clumsy attempt had been made to paint over her initials on the trunk. Confronted with this evidence, Holmes denied killing the Williams girls. Instead, he told a bizarre story claiming that Minnie had attacked and killed her sister Nettie. Allegedly, to protect Minnie, whom he professed to love, Holmes advised her to go to Europe while he disposed of Nettie's body by carrying it to the lake and sinking it. In 1880, I.L. Connor, a jeweler, married a beautiful 18-year-old woman named Smythe in Davenport, Iowa. About a year later, a daughter was born whom they named Gertrude. In 1889, Connor relocated with his family to Chicago and obtained employment in Holmes' drugstore, which was situated in the castle. Mrs. Connor remained a strikingly beautiful woman, and being possessed of considerable business acumen, Holmes often consulted her regarding several of his schemes, creating a relationship of mutual confidence. Differences soon arose between Connor and his wife, resulting in him leaving, while Mrs. Connor and their daughter Gertrude continued to reside at Holmes Castle. In 1892, both Mrs. Connor and Gertrude mysteriously disappeared. While in prison in Philadelphia, Holmes was interrogated about their fate. He claimed that Mrs. Connor had died from an operation, but professed ignorance regarding what had become of Gertrude. On August 2nd, 1895, some of Mrs. Connor's clothing was discovered in the castle and identified by her husband. On the same day, janitor Pat Quinlan and his wife confessed that they had seen Mrs. Connor's dead body in the castle. Earlier, on July 22nd, A. Minier, a nephew of Mrs. Connor, had sworn to a warrant charging Holmes with her murder. Her father, a Smythe, produced a letter purportedly written by Mrs. Connor in November 1892, stating that she intended to go to St. Louis. Smythe testified that the handwriting was a poor imitation of his daughter's penmanship. In 1892, Holmes was president of the ABC Copying Company, which also maintained offices in the castle. Miss Emily Sigrand, formerly employed as a stenographer at the hospital in Dwight, Illinois, where Pitzel, under the name of Phelps, had been treated, was recommended to Holmes by Pitzel after her dismissal. Miss Sigrand and Holmes became very close, assuming the identities of Mr. and Mrs. Gordon while residing in apartments near the corner of Ashland Avenue and West Madison Street. She regularly wrote to her parents in Oxford, Indiana, several times a week, but after December 6, 1892, no further letters were received, and she was never heard from again. Holmes was suspected of murdering other individuals with whom he had business dealings who also vanished, but due to inconclusive evidence, no further details are provided. And on July 28th, Charles M. Chappell of 129th Street, Chicago, reported to Lieutenant Thomas of the Cottage Grove Station that he had worked for Holmes as a handyman during the summer of 1892. On October 1st, Holmes asked Chappell if he could mount a skeleton. Chappell agreed, and Holmes provided him with a human skeleton to prepare. When the work was completed, Holmes paid Chappell $36. In January of 1893, Chappell was entrusted with yet another human skeleton to mount. When Holmes first presented the body to him, it was lying in the laboratory and still retained a considerable amount of flesh. Holmes possessed a full set of surgical instruments and a tank filled with fluid used for removing flesh, and he appeared to make no effort whatsoever to conceal these preparations from Chappell. Under these circumstances, Chappell believed that the work was being done legitimately, for some medical college, and therefore entertained no suspicions regarding its origin. Again, in June of 1893, Holmes delivered another skeleton to Chappell for mounting. However, Holmes never returned to claim it, and when Chappell later came forward with his disclosures, he turned this skeleton over to the police on the same day. On October 28, 1895, the trial of Holmes for the murder of Benjamin Pittesel commenced in Philadelphia. The process of selecting jurors had scarcely begun when a disagreement arose between Holmes and his attorneys, resulting in their temporary withdrawal from the case. During their absence, Holmes undertook the examination personally and conducted his own defense for a time. The prosecution advanced the theory that Holmes had administered chloroform to Pittesel, while the latter was either asleep or in a state of intoxication. 3 physicians testified in support of this claim, stating unequivocally that death was caused by chloroform poisoning. Mrs. Pittesel, who by this time had become almost a physical wreck from prolonged grief and anxiety, identified a photograph as that of her deceased husband. She also positively identified the clothing removed from the body buried in the potter's field as having belonged to Mr. Pittesel. She then testified at length concerning the insurance swindle conspiracy and repeated numerous conversations she had held with Holmes regarding her husband's supposed whereabouts. To refute Holmes' assertion that Pittesel had contemplated suicide, Mrs. Pittesel produced a letter written by her husband only a few days before his death, in which he expressed his intention of having his family join him in Philadelphia at an early date. Several witnesses who had known Pittesel under the assumed name of Perry while he occupied the premises at 1316 Callowhill Street identified the photograph of Pittesel as that of the man they knew as Perry. Many of these individuals had seen the corpse and testified that the remains were those of the same man. A number of these witnesses further stated that Perry was last seen alive at about 10:30 p.m. on Saturday, September 1st, 1894, when he visited a nearby saloon to purchase enough whiskey to last him through Sunday, the excise laws prohibiting the sale of liquor on that day. Eugene Smith, who had placed the patent set saw with Perry, testified that he discovered the body on the following Tuesday. Expert witnesses further testified that the condition of the remains indicated that death had occurred at least 2 days earlier, establishing that Pittesel must have died on Sunday. Miss Yoke, who believed herself to be the lawful wife of Holmes, testified that at this time she and Holmes were residing at 1905 North 11th Street. She stated that on Saturday evening a man called to see Holmes, and that Holmes told her the visitor was a prominent railroad official who intended to place a large order for his patent copier. Holmes later admitted, however, that the man was in fact Pittesel. Miss Yoke also testified that Holmes left their apartment at approximately 10:30 a.m. on Sunday and did not return until 4:30 p.m., and that upon his return his excited and overheated condition immediately attracted her attention. They hurriedly packed their belongings and left that night for Indianapolis, staying there only a few days before proceeding to St. Louis, where Holmes called on Mrs. Pittesel. It was established that on August 9th, 1894, Holmes had telegraphed $157.50 to the Chicago office of the Fidelity Mutual Life Association to pay the half-yearly premium on Pittesel's policy. No witnesses were called on the defense's behalf. In his instructions to the jury, Judge Arnold, commenting on Holmes' complete control over Pittesel, remarked, "Truth is stranger than fiction, and if Mrs. Pittesel's story is true, it is the most extraordinary exhibition of the power of mind over mind I have ever witnessed, and stranger than any novel I have ever read." On November 2nd, 1895, the case was submitted to the jury, and after a brief deliberation, a verdict of guilty was returned. On May 7th, 1896, Holmes was executed by hanging in Moyamensing Prison, Philadelphia. He maintained an air of utter indifference toward his fate. A few days prior to his death, when it was clear that all hope had vanished, Holmes made a confession, claiming that he had killed 27 people. However, on the scaffold, he contradicted this statement, asserting that the only death for which he was either directly or indirectly responsible involved 2 women upon whom he had performed criminal operations. Case 3. Let me explain now. Peter Mortensen was a well-known contractor and builder in Salt Lake City, Utah, who had purchased a large quantity of supplies from the Pacific Lumber Company, where James R. Hayes served as secretary and treasurer. Miss Mortensen was indebted to the company in the amount of $3,907 and had been urged to settle the account at once. He visited the company's office on December 16, 1901, at about 6 p.m., with the intention of arranging payment. At the office, he met Secretary Hay and Manager Romney. Mortensen gave them an order on another individual for $107 and stated that the remaining balance of $3,800 was at his residence in Forestdale, a suburb of the city. He further explained that if Mr. Hay, who lived in the same area, would come to his house that evening with a receipted bill, the balance would be paid in full. It was close to 8 p.m. when the three men left the office. Mr. Hay and Mortensen traveled home together on the Calder's parked car, Hay carrying the receipted bill with him. Hay reached his home at 8:45 p.m., and after supper he told his wife and children that he was going to Mortensen's house to collect some money and would return shortly. At 10:20 p.m., Mrs. Hay and the children went to bed, but at 1 a.m. she awoke and became uneasy because of her husband's prolonged absence. She remained awake, and at 3 a.m. went to Mortensen's home. After waking him, she asked about her husband. Mortensen appeared very nervous and said that Mr. Hay had left his house hours earlier and had gone to Mr. Romney's home, adding that Hay had likely missed the last car back. The following morning, Mrs. Hay telephoned Mr. Romney, who told her that he had not seen her husband since about 8 o'clock the previous evening. Romney then contacted Mortensen, who stated that he had paid Hay $3,800 the night before in $20 gold pieces, which he had hidden in glass jars in his cellar, and that Hay had then set out for Romney's office. Mr. James Sharp, the father of Mrs. Hay, after learning of his son-in-law's disappearance, accompanied the police to Mortensen's residence. Mortensen produced a receipt which he claimed had been given to him by Hay for the money, and stated that he and the missing man had sat together on a small settee while counting it. A conversation then followed between the elderly Mormon, Sharp, and Mortensen. Sharp, where was the last place you saw my son-in-law? Mortensen, here, pointing to a place on the walk about 10 feet from the house. Sharp, if that is the last spot where you saw him, then that is where you killed him. Mortensen, how do you know that he is dead? Sharp, I have had a vision, and the proof will be this. Within 24 hours, and within 1 mile of the place where you are now standing, his dead body will be dug up from a field. Mortensen seemed stunned and made no answer. At that time, the ground was covered with snow. On the following morning, December 18th, Frank Torgerson was searching a field near Mortensen's residence for horses when, close to a fence running parallel with the Park City Railroad track, he noticed a large quantity of blood. This discovery led him to carefully examine the surrounding area, and as a result, he came upon a mound covered with snow about the size of a grave. Torgerson then went to Mortensen's house and asked to borrow a shovel. Mortensen lent him one, saying it was the only shovel he owned, although another shovel was later found that appeared to have been recently cleaned. Torgerson returned to the mound and, after digging for a short time, uncovered the body of Hay. A bullet wound was discovered in the back of Hay's head. Word of the findings spread rapidly, and many people gathered at the location, among them Royal B. Young. Mr. Romney had seen Hay place the receipt for Mortensen in the inside pocket of his coat on the evening of the 16th, and when the body was examined, this pocket was found turned inside out, while Hay's watch and other jewelry remained untouched. The body was then placed in a wagon and taken into town, with Mortensen accompanying it. When the wagon stopped in front of Hendry's store, the father-in-law, Sharp, appeared, standing beside Mortensen and looking at the body of his dead son-in-law. He said, "He murdered you for the receipt that was on your body, and he never paid you a single dollar." Mortensen offered no response and merely lowered his head. To three men named Penrose, Hilton, and Sheets, Mortensen gave conflicting accounts regarding the type and number of containers used to hold the $3,800 he claimed to have paid Hay, as well as where they were hidden. To one man, he said the money was kept in a sack. To another, he stated that 2 glass fruit jars were used. And to the third, he claimed that 3 jars were required. To 2 of the witnesses, he said the money was concealed on a wall in the basement, while to another, he asserted that part of it was hidden in the pantry. After Mortensen pointed out the place on the wall where the jars were said to have been hidden, an immediate examination was made, and it was discovered that the dust there was entirely undisturbed. The basement contained 4 window openings, making it very well lighted, although no windows were actually in place, and the basement itself was open and accessible to strangers. Had glass jars been placed where Mortensen indicated, both the jars and their contents could easily have been seen. It was also clearly shown that a single jar of the size described by Mortensen would have been sufficient to contain the entire sum of money. Charles F. Watkins, Mortensen's brother-in-law, testified that he asked Peter whether he could prove that he had paid the money to Hay. Mortensen replied, "I can, But as my books are in bad condition, it will be necessary for me to state that you loan me $1,500. Watkins answered that his own bank account would not allow him to make such a false representation. It was also shown that the small settee on which Mortensen claimed that he and Hayes sat while counting the money was too small to accommodate two men at the same time. On the night of the homicide, the moon was shining brightly, and John Allen, a motorman, testified that his car passed the spot where the body was later found at about 10:20 p.m. He stated that he saw a man carrying a shovel on his shoulder cross the track, and by the aid of the moonlight and the headlight of the car, he recognized the man as Mortensen. On December 18th, Mortensen was placed under arrest. During the trial, James Sharp, the father-in-law of the murdered man, testified, and on cross-examination, the defense brought out the statement that Sharp claimed to have received a revelation from God, who told him that Peter Mortensen had murdered his son-in-law for a receipt and buried the body in a nearby field. Because 4 members of the jury belonged to the Mormon Church and believed in the doctrine of revelation, this testimony was considered extremely damaging to Mortensen's defense. Mortensen's business dealings and financial condition were also closely examined, and evidence was presented tending to show that it was impossible for the defendant to have been in possession of $3,800 on the night of the crime. Mortensen testified regarding his movements on that evening and gave a detailed account of how he claimed to have handed $190 gold pieces to Hay while they were seated on the settee. He also described the manner in which he asserted that Hay left the house shortly afterward. Mrs. Mortensen supported several of her husband's statements with her own testimony. The jury later visited Mortensen's home under the supervision of Royal B. Young, who had been present at the grave when Hay's body was exhumed and who had accompanied the authorities during their investigation at Mortensen's residence. Mortensen refused to accompany the jury on this inspection. The defendant was found guilty of murder, but the case was appealed to the Supreme Court on the grounds of misconduct by members of the jury and by Young at the premises. Alma H. Rock, one of the jurors, swore in an affidavit that Young had told the jurors that the premises had been altered since the day of the murder and that Young pointed out a spot near a fence where he claimed to have found a depression in the snow, which in his opinion was caused by the body being thrown over the fence, the head striking the snow. Young admitted that Rock's affidavit was true and a new trial was ordered. This second trial also resulted in a conviction. The case was once more appealed to the Supreme Court on the basis of newly discovered evidence, but the request for another trial was denied. On October 6, 1903, Judge Moore sentenced Mortensen to death, setting the execution for November 20th. As the law allowed the condemned to choose the method of execution, the judge asked, "What mode of execution do you elect?" Mortensen stood upright and in a firm voice replied, "I elect to be shot." On November 14th, the State Board of Pardons declined to commute his sentence. The night before the execution, Governor Wells spent much of the evening with Mortensen, who presented a highly elaborate defense, but the governor refused to intervene. On November 20th, at 10:30 a.m., Mortensen was led into the prison yard. Displaying courage to the end, he said, "I did not kill Jimmy Hay. Neither here nor in the hereafter will I forgive those who are responsible for my death." He refused to see a minister of any denomination and also declined stimulants, explaining that he required neither. After bidding the guards farewell, he was secured in the chair designated for the execution. A physician affixed a piece of white pasteboard over Mortensen's heart, while the execution squad of 5 men remained hidden behind a curtain hung in the doorway of the blacksmith shop, about 12 yards away. Each man was given a loaded rifle, though one rifle contained a blank cartridge, ensuring that no one could be certain whether he fired a live bullet or a harmless blank. At the command, "Fire," 4 bullets pierced the cardboard and struck Mortensen's heart. His head fell onto his chest. His hands trembled briefly, and then all was still. Case 4, let me explain now in memoriam. Donna Marie Dixon, 1956 to 1974. Donna Marie Dixon, courtesy of her friends. Though more than 40 years have passed, the memory of Donna Marie Dixon has not faded with time. Her life, brief as it was, continues to live on in the hearts of 4 of her friends who wish to honor her, remember her, and share their love in the following statement. This tribute is written by her friend Pam, mentioned later in the story, along with Lauren, Susie, and Rick. Donna Marie Dixon was a sweet and loving girl. Her joys in life were simple, enjoying the food her mama made. Her favorite, of course, was just good food. Her favorite song was Stairway to Heaven. Her favorite flowers were mums, and the birds she loved most were cardinals. Her dream was to work with animals. Pam, her best friend, moved back to Newport News after the tragedy. Imagine the trauma of being asked to identify your friend, yet not even recognizing her. Not a day goes by that Pam doesn't think of Donna. She wants the world to know that Leroy or Lee does exist. She saw him get into the cab with Wes, Bonnie, and Donna. We're still searching for photos of Donna to share online and hope someone out there has new information about this case. We need justice for Donna, taken far too soon. Edipe. Since the publication of the story below, it has become the most popular on this blog. It has even sparked curiosity about the identity of Timothy McCorkadell's accomplice, leading to the creation of the Reddit thread, "Who was Leroy?" on the Unresolved Mystery subreddit. According to Donna's friends, an Atlanta detective is reviewing the old case files to uncover the true identity of Leroy. On a routine patrol in Clayton County, Georgia, a police officer noticed a white object near the shoulder of Slate Road and Highway 42-1 that at first glance looked like a bag of trash. Illegal dumping was fairly common in his work, so he stopped to investigate. As he walked closer and shined his flashlight on the object, the horrifying truth became clear. The large, pale shape had legs, arms, breasts, and a head. Sometimes a flashlight reveals things we would rather not see, and this was one of those times. The officer looked down in shock at a young, shapely girl who appeared to have been tortured to death. Unsure if she was still alive, he approached carefully, ready to provide aid. But when he touched her cold skin, he realized she was gone. The officer immediately radioed headquarters for backup and began securing the scene. The sight was truly horrifying. Her face was a distorted mass, barely recognizable. Her nose flattened, her features swollen and covered in purplish bruises that pushed everything out of place. Shining the flashlight over her body revealed even more. Long, thin welts on her thighs from whipping, small circular scorch marks on her torso and breasts indicating cigarette burns, and hot red candle wax poured across her stomach, inner thighs, and between her legs. When her body had been discarded from the car, it landed on its side with arms and legs splayed unnaturally, suggesting bones had been broken either before or after death. Her killers had clearly made mistakes. Near the scene, the officer found a distinct tire track ready to be cast in plaster of Paris. Next to the girl lay a blood-stained section of a cardboard box, wrapped with black tape and covered in what appeared to be fibers, possibly from a carpet. Despite their mistakes, her killers had done one thing deliberately. They removed her clothes and stole her identification. Yet there were other ways to identify a corpse. An ambulance carried the girl's broken body to the Fulton County Medical Examiner's office in nearby Atlanta, where fingerprints could reveal her identity. In the worst-case scenario, the medical examiner could resort to dental records. Although Atlanta and its surrounding suburbs have grown exponentially since 1974, at the time the city was much smaller. But even then, residents saw how rapidly it had expanded over the previous decades. That growth had attracted a wide range of people: hippies, motorcycle gangs, runaways, and hustlers, to a midtown district known as the Peachtree Strip. More commonly called the Strip, it was a seedy stretch of rundown motels, dimly lit strip clubs, dangerous bars, and cheap apartment houses. Since there were no local missing person reports of a 5'4", 140-pound brunette girl, Clayton County investigators initially assumed she was one of Atlanta's many runaways. Literally, thousands of runaway teenagers find a home among the dubious denizens of the Strip, a crime magazine reported the following year. Detectives believe the victim may have come from among their number. It was nearly impossible to walk the streets without encountering clusters of the unwashed and unemployed, most of them young, and many looking for a victim or a handout. 2 days after the gruesome discovery, on Saturday, a confidential informant working for Sheriff Earl Lee of nearby Douglas County provided investigators with 2 names potentially linked to the girl's death: a young woman in her 20s known as Bonnie, and a man, also in his 20s, known as Wes or West. Both were known to frequent the Strip. For Sheriff Lee, This informant was exceptionally reliable and had a proven track record. If he said to look for Bonnie and West, that was exactly what investigators needed to do. With a solid lead pointing to the rundown strip, a special squad of Atlanta homicide detectives was formed to investigate possible connections. They began a meticulous canvass of the area, building by building, person by person, and it wasn't long before they found people who knew the victim. The strip may have been full of petty thieves, drug dealers, pimps, and hustlers, but when it came to murder, detectives knew someone would eventually talk. And that is exactly what happened. One afternoon, while speaking to a young couple in a bar, a teenage girl informed detectives that the victim was a friend of hers who had hitchhiked to Atlanta after running away from her parents' home in Newport News, Virginia. Her name was Donna Marie Dixon, and she was just 17 years old. Donna Marie Dixon, courtesy of her friends. Donna Marie Dixon, photo courtesy of her friends. The teenage girl was asked to identify her friend at the morgue, but she could not recognize Donna's battered face. The victim's parents were then contacted in Newport News, and her stepfather delivered the heartbreaking news to her mother. When they came to retrieve her daughter's body the following week, Donna's parents were able to make a positive identification. By that time, however, police already knew with certainty that the victim was Donna Marie Dixon. It turned out there were many Bonnies associated with the strip, but local small-time criminals, often knowing more than the police, were able to connect the name Bonnie with a man named West, who was actually Wes McCorkadale, a tall, baby-faced 21-year-old from Alma, Georgia. McCorkadale was slight in build, with stringy blonde hair that covered his ears, and during colder months, he often wore the same coat described by witnesses. Both suspects lived in an apartment on Moreland Avenue in southeast Atlanta, in the same direction from the strip that led to the location where Donna's body was dumped. As the detectives left the bar after learning the suspects' names, they got into their car and were about to drive to the apartment complex when they noticed a young, slightly built man with stringy blonde hair wearing the same colored coat they had been told to watch for. Slowly exiting their car, they approached him, identified themselves, and demanded his name. It was Timothy Wesley McCorkadale. During his interrogation at headquarters, McCorkadale stated that Bonnie was his girlfriend, Bonnie Suckraw Johnson, and he provided her address and workplace, where she was subsequently picked up and brought in for questioning. Although McCorkadale quickly waived his right to counsel and gave a full confession, it was his girlfriend Bonnie's statement that was used during his trial. The two lived together in an apartment on the 700 block of Moreland Avenue, sharing the space with Bonnie's 3-year-old daughter by another man and a female roommate, Linda Deering, who was 8 months pregnant. Both Linda and Bonnie were granted immunity in exchange for their statements, which would later be described as some of the most shocking, cold-blooded, and horrific testimony ever presented in a Georgia courtroom. In the early hours of January 17th, Bonnie explained that she left the bar where she worked and met McCorkadale at another nightclub. Inside, McCorkadale confronted Donna Marie Dixon, accusing her of stealing $50 from his acquaintance, a man named Leroy. Despite Donna's repeated and firm denials, McCorkadale would not let the issue go, and Bonnie attempted to calm him. She then took Donna into the ladies' room for a full search, which revealed nothing. Undeterred, McCorkadale insisted that Donna had given the money to a black man he had seen her talking with, whom he assumed was her pimp. Outside the nightclub, McCorkadale launched into a tirade of racist insults over her supposed association. Later, McCorkadale, Donna Dixon, Leroy, and Bonnie took a taxi back to Bonnie's apartment, where McCorkadale's obsession with the alleged $50 theft intensified through aggressive questioning, implying Donna's guilt. As Donna sat there, sobbing and quietly denying the accusations against her, McCorkadale suddenly shifted tactics. Pretending to console her, he gently stroked the back of her head with his left hand. Bonnie, observing closely, noticed the sudden change in his expression and immediately realized what was coming next. Without warning, McCorkadale drew back his fist and struck Donna in the face. From that moment, he and Leroy began slapping, punching, and beating her as they forced her down to the floor. The noise awakened the young couple's roommate, Linda, who had been sleeping in the back bedroom with Bonnie's 3-year-old daughter. Together, Bonnie and Linda watched, paralyzed, as McCorkadale and Leroy continued to torture the girl for hours, doing nothing to intervene. The men tied her wrists with Bonnie's nylons and continued their relentless assault, slapping and punching her while verbally abusing her for associating with a black man and not staying with her own kind. To suppress her screams, they stuffed a washcloth into her mouth and secured it with electrical tape. McCorkadale then removed his leather belt, which had a large Western-style buckle, and used it to whip Donna. Her clothes were torn off, leaving her completely nude, gagged, and bound. The torture escalated further. Cigarette burns were applied across her body, and hot red wax from a candle was dripped on her stomach, inner thighs, and private areas. The two men took turns sexually assaulting her, vaginally, anally, and orally, and her genitals were mutilated with scissors and chemicals. Bonnie recounted the events to detectives in a calm, emotionless manner, leaving them horrified. After the assault, Donna was briefly allowed to wash up in the bathroom. The 3-year-old child was returned to her bedroom, and a story was concocted that Timothy and Bonnie were helping a kitten with a broken leg. Linda later claimed she stayed in the bedroom and did not witness what happened next. In the living room, McCorkadale and Leroy discussed killing Donna. Timothy instructed Bonnie to fetch a rope, and she provided a thin clothesline she had recently purchased. Donna, coaxed out of the bathroom and a closet where she had hidden, was ambushed from behind by McCorkadale, who attempted to strangle her. Bonnie intervened, warning Leroy to help restrain McCorkadale or Donna would be killed. Both men eventually pulled him off, but Donna was barely alive, convulsing, her eyelids fluttering. Despite the opportunity to call for help, Bonnie, Linda, and Leroy submitted to McCorkadale's will. He returned to the attack, straddling her and choking her to death, violently slamming her head up and down until her neck broke. Afterward, the group faced the challenge of disposing of her body. They used a cardboard trunk that had previously stored Bonnie's daughter's toys and clothes. McCorkadale stomped on Donna's limbs to fit her inside, breaking her bones in the process. Linda later described the sound as like a big stick being broken. McCorkadale later provided a written statement to police detailing how he had disposed of the body and destroyed evidence. The following day, he and Bonnie returned to the strip, where a friend with a van assisted in dumping the box at the side of the road. McCorkadale claimed the friend did not know the contents. The identity of Leroy was never discovered. Bonnie and Linda did not know his last name, and no one on the streets could identify him. It was assumed that he left town after the murder. Meanwhile, police found Donna's blood in the apartment and recovered her discarded belongings in dumpsters, including clothes, jewelry, a purse, and an address book with her parents' Newport News address. On February 6, 1974, McCorkadale was indicted for first-degree murder, and his trial began in April in Atlanta. His defense attempted to enter a guilty plea, but Judge Osgood Williams refused, insisting that a jury determine the punishment. The trial revealed horrific testimony from Bonnie and Linda, describing the torture and murder in excruciating detail. During testimony, Assistant District Attorney Melvin England asked Bonnie if Donna said anything while being strangled. Calmly, Bonnie replied. She said, "Oh my God, he's going to kill me." The jury, composed of 6 men and 6 women, became increasingly horrified. Bonnie also recounted a phone call from Linda, instructing her to have McCorkadale remove Donna's body, which was beginning to smell. After 97 minutes of deliberation, McCorkadale was convicted on April 12th and sentenced to death. The Georgia Supreme Court denied his appeal in December 1974, though Governor Jimmy Carter granted an indefinite stay of execution as the death penalty was reconsidered nationally. In May 1980, McCorkadale and 3 other death row inmates offered to participate in a military mission to rescue American hostages in Iran, though no response was received. On July 28, 1980, McCorkadale, Troy Gregg, Johnny L. Johnson, and David A. Jarrell escaped from Reidsville, Georgia, maximum security prison, using hacksaw blades smuggled in by a corrupt guard and aided by McCorkadale's family. 3 were captured 2 days later in North Carolina, while Gregg was killed in a confrontation. 11 people, including McCorkadale's mother and aunt, were indicted for assisting the escape. McCorkadale's appeals continued for 7 years, claiming memory loss and mental strain. He also underwent a religious transformation. On September 21st, 1987, at 7:23 p.m., Timothy Wesley McCorkadale was executed in Georgia's electric chair. He was 35 years old. Donna Marie Dixon would have been 31. Case 5, let me explain a stocky Ephraim DeVerley, the real-life arms dealer portrayed by Jonah Hill in War Dogs. Sat across from me, Matthew Cox, and my literary agent, Ross Reback. For the sake of full honesty, I should clarify that although I was a true crime writer, at that moment I was also a federal prisoner. Like DeVerley, I was dressed in a hunter green prison-issued uniform. Nearly 100 inmates and their visitors were crammed into the rectangular visitation room, their overlapping conversations bouncing off the concrete walls and barred windows. 2 broad-shouldered Federal Bureau of Prisons correctional officers sat stationed behind a desk, their gazes constantly darting from one person to another. I listened as Reback pitched DeVerley on the concept of a collaboration. His plan was twofold. First, to secure a publishing deal for the book I was meant to write, and second, to sell the film rights to that book in hopes of having it adapted into a movie. It's important to understand the context. A year earlier, Rolling Stone had published an article titled Arms and the Dudes, written by contributing editor Guy Lawson. The piece was based on DeVerley's former business partner, David Pacuz, and his account of their shared exploits. Not long after, the film rights were snapped up by Rat Pack Entertainment in partnership with Warner Brothers Pictures. DeVerley looked at Reback and asked, "What if Warner makes the movie? What if they beat us to it?" Then we sue them for stealing our intellectual property," Reback replied. That statement struck me as strange, considering I had only just begun writing the manuscript. The supposed intellectual property that would eventually become DeVerley's true crime memoir. "How exactly are you going to sue Warner?" I asked. Their project was being developed from a Rolling Stone article, not from my unfinished and at that point non-existent book. I'm not even close to done. Yet there, deep inside the largest prison complex in the United States, the idea for a scheme to swindle Warner Brothers out of millions of dollars was born. And remarkably, they succeeded. Confidence men are the aristocracy of the underworld. They occupy the highest rank in the world of the con, writes David W. Maurer, Ph.D., in his book The American Confidence, and my name is Matthew Cox, and I am a con man. I served a long sentence at the Federal Correctional Complex in Coleman, Florida, after being convicted of numerous bank fraud-related offenses, and I am completely guilty of every single one. As far as prisons go, Coleman wasn't the worst place to end up. It was relatively clean, and most of the inmates were nonviolent. Mostly, I've always loved movies. In the early 2000s, inspired by Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, I created close to a dozen synthetic identities. Lee Black, Michael White, Brandon Green, William Blue, and several others. Using these carefully crafted personas, I persuaded multiple banks across the country to loan my so-called borrowers more than $11.5 million. For a while, life was great, but it didn't last forever. Just days before the FBI raided my home, and before my unavoidable arrest, I fled Florida. The guy was good. Very good, said Gail McKenzie, the lead U.S. prosecutor on my case, during an interview with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The number of banks involved, the volume of identities used, and the sophistication of the scheme made the case extremely unique. I in the first-class cabin of a commercial jet flying over the Gulf of Mexico. My brother-in-law, Jack Townsend, was engaged in casual conversation with his client, Ross Reback. Reback liked to think of himself as a serious Hollywood insider. He'd experienced modest success after selling one of his many reality TV concepts to a major network. Later, while pitching other ideas, the entertainment agency representing him helped broker a deal with Oscar de la Hoya for a reality show called The Contender. Coincidentally, the concept closely resembled one Reback had previously developed. Seeing an opening, he filed a lawsuit against the network, his agent, and the entertainment agency, claiming theft of intellectual property. After a year of legal wrangling, the agency gave in and settled the case. Townsend and Reback were headed to Los Angeles specifically to finalize the settlement when Townsend asked, "So what's next for you?" "I don't really know," Reback replied. "Have you been following those St. Petersburg Times articles about a mortgage broker who's been scamming banks?" He went on to describe my crimes and added, "It's like a catch-me-if-you-can story." Townsend showed no reaction. "Honestly, it'd make a great movie." "Yeah," Townsend muttered. "His name is Matt Cox, and he's my brother-in-law." In December 2005, Ephraim DeVerley, a chunky Jewish kid from Miami Beach, was boasting to his friend David Packoz about the fortune he was making selling weapons. DeVerley had been introduced to the arms business as a teenager by his uncle. He soon began bidding on government weapons and ammunition solicitations through FedBiz Ops. One small contract led to another, then another, and before long, DeVerley was landing deals worth millions of dollars. Packoz eventually agreed to go into business with him, and the two began submitting bids for government contract from DeVerley's one-bedroom apartment. Not long after that, they secured a massive $298 million contract. The U.S. Army needed ammunition for Soviet-style weapons to equip the Afghan National Army. To fulfill the deal, DeVerley and Packoz started negotiating with former Soviet bloc countries across Europe. Around the same time that DeVerley and Packoz were flying enormous shipments of cargo into Afghanistan, I was in Nashville, Tennessee, operating under a stolen identity of my own. By the middle of 2006, I had already conned local lenders out of nearly $3 million. Then, in November, Fortune magazine published an article detailing my exploits. Just days later, I stumbled across a blog post discussing an upcoming Dateline episode that would focus entirely on my schemes. My face was about to be beamed into living rooms all across the country. I hurriedly grabbed a duffel bag stuffed with cash and a passport issued under a fake name. I was ready to run, but it was already too late. On November 16th, 2006, Secret Service agents swooped in and arrested me. 1 year later, I was sentenced to 26 years in prison. This is where DeVerley and Packoz began to unravel. In March 2007, DeVerley learned that Albania was sitting on a massive stockpile of AK-47 ammunition, enough to satisfy his entire task order. What DeVerley didn't realize was that from the 1950s through the 1970s, Albania's former communist government had sourced most of its ammunition from the People's Republic of China. The problem was that the United States had a strict embargo on all Chinese weapons and munitions. Despite this, DeVerley went ahead and negotiated a deal with the Albanians. He repackaged the AK-47 rounds and began shipping the embargoed ammunition as if it were legitimate. At first, everything seemed to be going smoothly. But once the money started rolling in, DeVerley began questioning the financial arrangement between himself and Packoz. As a result of a false complaint filed by a competitor, DeVerley's office was raided on August 23, 2007, by agents from the military's Defense Criminal Investigative Service. That on March 27, 2008, the New York Times published an article titled "Supplier Under Scrutiny" on aging arms for Afghans. The piece detailed how DeVerley had been snapping up munitions across Eastern Europe to fulfill his government contract, as well as his method of repackaging Chinese ammunition, an explicit violation of United States law, all in an effort to conceal the true origin of the products from the U.S. Army. The article also questioned how a 21-year-old, backed by a staff of mostly 20-somethings, could possibly manage such an enormous volume of government work. Packoz was sentenced to 7 months of home confinement. DeVerley, however, received a far harsher punishment. On August 23, 2011, he was sentenced to 6 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The low-security prison at FCC Coleman is where I eventually met Ephraim DeVerley. Months earlier, I had read Guy Lawson's Rolling Stone article, "Arms and the Dudes." The story, largely told from David Packoz's perspective, chronicled the bizarre rise of DeVerley and Packoz as Stoner International arms dealers. At the time, I was already deep into writing my own memoir, so I approached DeVerley about the idea of telling his story as well. "I'll think about it," he said, without much conviction. "I'll let you know." Meanwhile, my brother-in-law, Jack Townsend, and his client, Ross Reback, sat waiting in the prison's visitation room. A few weeks earlier, I had mailed Reback a copy of my manuscript. After reading it, he decided he wanted to represent me. Reback said all the things an aspiring writer longs to hear. I took to him immediately. He was a self-aggrandizing narcissist, but in the best possible way. I was drawn in by his confidence, his passion, and his deep understanding of both the literary world and the film industry. By the time the visit ended, I was completely sold. Sometime in the autumn, I was hurrying across the prison compound toward the library when DeVerley stopped me in my tracks. Barely able to contain himself, he excitedly told me that Guy Lawson had sold the film rights to the Rolling Stone article, Arms and the Dudes. Rat Pack Entertainment and Warner Brothers had bought the rights, and they were officially planning to turn it into a movie. Todd Phillips, the guy who made the Hangover movies, is going to direct it, DeVerley said. That's pretty cool, right? Honestly stunned, I replied. You seem like a sharp guy, Ephraim, but this isn't cool at all. Have you ever seen the Hangover movies? Phillips is going to make something like, dude, where's my hand grenade? Your name is going to be synonymous with Jeff Spicoli from Fast Times at Ridgemont High. You're going to become a joke. The excitement drained from DeVerley's face, and I added, you honestly seem smarter than this. I turned to walk away when DeVerley suddenly yelped, so, when can we start? Over the following months, I put together a detailed outline chronicling the former gunrunner's exploits. As I was finishing up the outline, DeVerley asked if he could read my manuscript. About a week later, he handed it back to me and said, I want you to write my memoir. By that point, I had already decided that I wanted to focus on writing prisoner stories, and DeVerley's tale was larger than life. It had everything I loved about true crime. Partner, I asked. Of course, DeVerley replied, and we shook on it. Sometime in February or March of 2013, I officially began working on a manuscript that would eventually be titled Once a Gunrunner. This is where things get interesting. A couple of months into the writing process, I convinced DeVerley to meet with my literary agent, Ross Reback. During that meeting, Reback laid out his credentials and explained why he believed he could help DeVerley and me secure both a book deal and a film deal before any of the other interested parties could get there first. As I expanded the outline into a full manuscript, often while sitting on a concrete table in the prison's recreation yard, I learned a great deal about Ephraim DeVerley. I started to realize that DeVerley's motivation went beyond simple greed. He seemed to derive a particular kind of satisfaction from cutting others out of their share. At times, DeVerley became disturbingly manic, giddily rambling about how he had figured out ways to bamboozle manufacturers. He laughed as he described what he called a legal bait-and-switch that he used when dealing with the U.S. government. Eventually, as the weeks dragged on, our conversations turned to the dispute between DeVerley and Pecuz. DeVerley admitted that he owed Pecuz millions of dollars, just as I had read in Lawson's Rolling Stone article. However, Pecuz had no contract, and DeVerley controlled all of the money. Pecuz was in a bad spot, DeVerley said. Then why not just pay him? I asked. Why would I, he said, when I can pay a lawyer 50 or 100 grand and screw him out of the money? He exploded into laughter, the kind he often slipped into without warning. I must have looked genuinely horrified by his cold indifference. DeVerley noticed immediately. Don't look at me like that, he snapped. You don't get it. But I did get it. I understood perfectly, and I also understood something else. None of DeVerley's promises, spoken or written, meant a damn thing. The only reassurance I clung to was my own private calculation. Reback was involved. He wouldn't let this guy screw me over. That was my ace in the hole, or so I told myself. The principles of the confidence game are ancient, Dr. David W. Maurer explains in The American Confidence Man. They are as old as civilization. However, the confidence games as we know them today have evolved. Modern con men, he writes, rely on variations of the classic big con schemes, all of which share the same underlying framework. The steps are these, Maurer explains. First, they locate a well-to-do victim. Using an accomplice, commonly referred to as a roper, the intended victim, or mark, is guided toward the inside man. In the end, the mark is systematically fleeced. At our next meeting, on May 2nd, 2013, Reback and I were waiting for DeVerley when I finally voiced my concerns about his character. There's nothing about this guy that makes him sympathetic, I said. I explained that DeVerley had been running scams and selling substandard junk to the government for years. He's a scumbag. What matters most, Reback replied calmly, is that you finish the manuscript as quickly as possible. His goal was to get DeVerley's memoir published before Warner Brothers started filming. Do what you can. The sex offender in Stranger Danger is more sympathetic than this guy, I said, locking eyes with Reback and holding the stare longer than was comfortable. And I signed a contract with him. I'm going to make sure you're taken care of, Reback assured me. He told me that if there was one thing I could rely on, it's that you can trust me. Time, however, was our enemy. DeVerley was scheduled to be transferred to the prison camp in Miami, which meant my window to complete the manuscript was shrinking fast. You know, Reback muttered, the protagonist in Stranger Danger and Ephraim actually have similar arcs. An unexpected rise from rags to riches. The nagging mother. The excess. The debauchery. He suggested that I lift scenes from Stranger Danger and use them as filler for Gunrunner, dramatizing whatever I could to make Ephraim appear more sympathetic. His only condition was that I be careful to incorporate Lawson's factual narrative into the later. DeVerley slid into the chair across from Reback and me. I sat quietly while Reback began pitching him on the idea of a partnership. DeVerley mentioned that he would soon be transferred to Miami, and that's when Reback brought up the idea of dramatizing and even outright fabricating certain portions of the memoir to speed up the process. Sure, DeVerley grunted dismissively. I don't give a shit. Let's just get it done. Then he looked at Reback and asked, what if Warner makes the movie? What if they beat us to the punch? Then we sue them for theft of intellectual property. Reback replied without hesitation. The statement immediately struck me as strange, since I had barely begun writing the manuscript. How are you going to sue Warner? I asked. The studio's project was being developed from Guy Lawson's Rolling Stone article, not from my unfinished, still largely imaginary book. I'm nowhere close to being done. But you will be, Reback said confidently. And it's not that hard to allege intellectual theft when there are competing versions. He went on to explain that once the manuscript existed, it wouldn't be difficult to manufacture a scenario in which he and DeVerley could claim that Warner had gained access to it. That, he said, would provide the foundation for a lawsuit. Warner Brothers Pictures was the second largest studio in the world. With a net worth in the billions, it made the perfect mark. Reback then casually admitted that years earlier he had sued a major television network along with a powerful entertainment agency, using evidence that had been contrived. As he spoke, DeVerley grinned broadly at the idea of filing a completely fabricated lawsuit. I extracted a significant settlement, Reback said, and I have no doubt we can do the same thing here. Unlike DeVerley, I was deeply unsettled by the tone of the conversation. It reeked of fraud. DeVerley, however, latched onto the idea immediately and told Reback that he had a cousin living in Los Angeles. He thinks he's in the entertainment industry. DeVerley laughed. He's a schmuck, but he knows a bunch of people. We can make this happen. I doubled my workload, pushing myself to complete as much of the manuscript as possible. Even so, the story was still only about 2/3 finished when DeVerley's name appeared on the transfer, also known as the pack-out list. The night before he left, DeVerley wrapped me in a big bear hug and launched into an emotional speech about our friendship. You know me better than my own family does, he said. I don't forget my friends, dude. I've got your back. Weeks later, I emailed the completed manuscript to Reback. A few days after that, I called him, expecting to hear a list of edits or revisions. I was certain he'd want changes. Instead, he said simply, "You knocked it out of the park." The mark is wary game, writes Dr. David W. Maurer. Although marks may be plentiful, they do not walk heedlessly into the traps of the confidence men. They must be found, he explains, then carefully stalked before the kill. Once a mark is properly sized up, he must be guided to the inside man. This demanding groundwork is handled by the roper. Ropers use various methods to flush their game, Maurer writes, but most rely entirely on chance encounters and casual contact to supply them with marks. Sometime in May, according to Reback. DeVerley reached out to his so-called schmuck cousin in Los Angeles and asked him to connect them with a Hollywood insider who could help move their project forward. They needed someone who could get them close to a producer, director, screenwriter, or executive at either Rat Pack Entertainment or Warner Brothers. Coincidentally, DeVerley's cousin knew just the right person. Elliot Kahn, a producer with Sunset Pictures, and the son of Erica Kahn, the executive producer of the 2013 documentary Blackfish, reached out to DeVerley and Reback. During their conversations, Kahn took the bait and expressed interest in pitching DeVerley's life rights as described in the Gunrunner manuscript. He believed that he and his business partner, Simon Spira, known as Shimmy, could help advance the project. In doing so, they unknowingly became DeVerley and Reback's ropers. During a phone call with Reback in mid to late July, he told me, Shimmy's father is Steven Spira, the president of worldwide business affairs at Warner Brothers. Okay, I replied. Given Kahn's and Shimmy's industry connections, their involvement made sense to me. So you want him to talk to his father or no? Not exactly, Reback said, pausing. It's just that Shimmy's involvement opens up additional opportunities for us. That's all. Reback explained that he had asked Kahn to have Shimmy sign a non-disclosure agreement before letting him read the manuscript. After Shimmy signed the NDA on July 28, 2014, Reback emailed him the Gunrunner manuscript, officially setting the stage for DeVerley and Reback's confidence game. After persuading Kahn to steer Shimmy into position, Reback arranged a three-way conference call between himself and his completely unsuspecting accomplices that on August 15, 2014, according to the complaint later filed by DeVerley and Reback, Reback asked Kahn and Shimmy how successful they had been in generating interest in the Gunrunner project. Well, Shimmy told Reback, based on what I'm hearing from my sources, Warner is finalizing the casting. In fact, he said, the studio had already secured Jonah Hill to portray DeVerley and Miles Teller to play Pacuz, and they're moving forward with the movie. And who exactly is your source? Reback asked, feigning ignorance, even though he already knew the answer. An unsuspecting Shimmy replied, my dad is Steven Spira. He's the president of business affairs at Warner Brothers at that moment. Reback pretended to be stunned by the so-called revelation. He grew visibly upset that the Gunrunner manuscript had ended up in the hands of one of Warner Brothers' senior executives. If I'd known who Shimmy's father was, he snapped at Kahn, I never would have allowed you to send him the manuscript. Blindsided, Kahn responded defensively. It wasn't my place to disclose who his father was. Reback abruptly ended the call. From his perspective, the plan had worked flawlessly. He now had what he needed to sue Warner Brothers, a direct link between the studio and possession of the Gunrunner manuscript. Almost immediately, Reback began consulting with multiple attorneys in preparation for filing an intellectual theft lawsuit. Around the same time, DeVerley was released from prison. With all the pieces of DeVerley and Reback's confidence game now seemingly in place, DeVerley suddenly cut off all communication with Reback. He stopped responding to emails and no longer returned voicemail messages. During a phone call sometime in late 2014 or early 2015, Reback told me that without DeVerley's participation, there was no way to move forward with pitching the story that a few weeks later, on February 1st, 2015, I wrote a blunt and sharply worded letter. I think you guys have reached a point where someone needs to cut through all the bullshit and state the obvious, I wrote. With Guy Lawson's book set to be released by Simon & Schuster and Warner Brothers already deep into production on their movie, Gunrunner was, in my view, dead in the water. I continued, explaining that suing Warner Brothers and Simon & Schuster wasn't going to work because they hadn't done anything wrong. It's a complete waste of time and money. I went on to say that DeVerley's only realistic option, at least in my opinion, was to self-publish the memoir, hire a publicist, and aggressively pursue interviews with outlets like the New York Times, Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, and others. While you and Ross Reback are talking to lawyers and chasing deals, I wrote, you're missing a massive opportunity. I urged DeVerley to get back in touch with Reback and to follow the plan we had originally agreed upon. About 2 weeks later, during a phone call with Reback, he told me that DeVerley had finally reached out to him. He apologized, Reback said, and spun some story about going on a drug-fueled bender. Then he got your letter, and that seemed to put everything into perspective for him. Warner Brothers began filming their adaptation of Guy Lawson's Rolling Stone article, Arms and the Dudes, in March 2015. The film was ultimately retitled War Dogs. Around the same time, Reback flew to Miami to meet with Billy Corben and his producing partner, the filmmakers behind the documentary Cocaine Cowboys, along with a female producer from CNN. According to Reback, DeVerley got drunk during the meeting and openly flirted with the CNN producer. Despite that, she pitched the idea of a 1-hour documentary centered on DeVerley's prison writing of the Gunrunner manuscript and, more broadly, his life story. Shortly after the meeting, Corben and his partner expressed interest in the project. However, neither side was in a position to pay DeVerley, and that was a deal-breaker for Reback. The exposure alone will drive book sales, I argued during a phone call. He has to do CNN. Come on, what are we even talking about here? I don't want to do anything that could jeopardize the lawsuit, Reback replied. You have to understand, I wasn't sitting around waiting for Reback to make something happen. I was actively writing stories for other inmates. It was then that I realized it was all a scam, a con game orchestrated by 2 skilled confidence men. The day the lawsuit was filed, April 28, 2016, Reback had arranged for nearly all the involved parties: Warner Brothers, Rat Pack Entertainment, the Mark Gordon Company, Todd Phillips, Bradley Cooper, 22nd and Green, Elliot Kahn, and Simon Shimmy Spira, to be served simultaneously. The lawsuit claimed that, because Lawson's article contained limited information about DeVerley, Kahn, and Shimmy, acting as agents for Phillips, Cooper, and Warner, approached DeVerley and Reback to obtain the Gunrunner manuscript. According to the complaint, the manuscript's contents were then allegedly used to write the War Dogs screenplay. In early August, I was seated in an area known as Stonehenge, just outside the Bee House building. The circular space consisted of a large concrete slab, with an outer ring of concrete seats surrounding tables and benches. Cox, called Dennis Caroni, an obnoxious inmate convicted of running a pill mill. As he approached, I noticed he was holding a copy of Ocean Drive, a glossy Miami magazine. You making any money on the DeVerley book? No, y grimasa. They're still looking for publishers. Caroni slapped the magazine onto the table and flipped it open. Are you sure? He said. 'Cause this says he published. Sure enough, on one of the pages was a photograph of DeVerley grinning from ear to ear while holding a copy of Once a Gunrunner. Behind him were hundreds of hardcover copies. The caption read, Ephraim DeVerley at the 2016 Miami Book Fair. Staring at that photo, I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. The lawsuit wasn't just about DeVerley and Reback tricking Shimmy into taking possession of the manuscript. It also relied on the assumption that the movie would contain scenes directly lifted from Gunrunner. On August 19th, 2016, Warner Brothers released War Dogs nationwide. The film earned tens of millions in its opening weeks and eventually grossed over $100 million worldwide. Yet the movie bore very little resemblance to DeVerley's story. During a call, Reback admitted, the movie is a lot different than Gunrunner. I could hear the stress in his voice. There are invented scenes, and, well, it's very different. In fact, it was so divergent that DeVerley and Reback's high-priced attorney, Thornburg, withdrew from a case. The most likely reason was that he refused to pursue claims against Warner that he now recognized as unsubstantial and likely false. Ephraim's book is a work of fiction, David Packouz told a reporter with New Times magazine. DeVerley says he was tricked into leaking the manuscript to the studio. 2 producers, Shimon Spira and Elliot Kahn, approached him in 2014 about adapting his still unpublished manuscript into a film, he claims. But Spira failed to disclose that his father was a high-ranking Warner Brothers executive. DeVerley asserts the pair gave the book to the studio. My buddy Pete spent most of his time helping other inmates with legal matters. 30 years ago, however, Pierre Pete Rozzini had been a 20-something Los Angeles-based drug trafficker, making millions. He and his associates drove luxury European supercars, lived in Beverly Hills penthouses, and dated Playboy models. That all ended, though, after 2 FBI informants were murdered landing Pete with a very, very long sentence. I confided in Pete about DeVerley and Reback's sham lawsuit and the fact that they hadn't paid me for the book. They used the manuscript I wrote to sue Warner, the very same manuscript they stole from me. I told him. I explained that, at DeVerley and Reback's urging, I had embellished and fictionalized a large portion of the book they were pitching as the real story. These guys are running a confidence game, I said. Here's the problem for DeVerley and Reback. Todd Phillips had only loosely based the War Dogs screenplay on Lawson's article, altering events so dramatically that the film barely resembled DeVerley's true crime memoir. In Warner's motion to dismiss the lawsuit, they explicitly characterized War Dogs as a fictionalized account. Because of this, DeVerley and Reback had no choice but to drop their intellectual property theft claims. But rather than accept defeat, they hired a new attorney, Kenneth Turkle of Bajo, Cuva, Cohen, Turkle, a prominent Tampa, Florida firm. Ken Turkle had just won the privacy lawsuit for wrestler Hulk Hogan against Gawker.com, resulting in a $115 million award that devastated Nick Dennon's media company. No doubt, Turkle was hoping to replicate that success against Warner. On November 3, 2016, Turkle filed a new lawsuit alleging false advertising under the Lanham Act, which prohibits false advertising in connection with commercial advertising or promotion. The suit claimed that Warner engaged in unfair competition by promoting War Dogs as a true depiction of DeVerley's life, when it clearly was not. They alleged that Warner's promotional materials misled consumers, quoting several statements in which the studio claimed the film was the true story. According to Turkle, these actions were designed to boost Warner's profits because true story films attract more audiences. The lawsuit further argued that, since DeVerley and Reback were selling a competing product, Once a Gun Runner, detailing the real story of DeVerley's exploits, Warner's false advertising caused economic harm to them. Ironically, in a twist unknown to Warner, the foundation of this new lawsuit was itself a lie. When does telling the truth ever help anybody? Ephraim DeVerley, War Dogs, why dramatize it? I asked Pete shortly after we learned of the new lawsuit. The story, the true story, is incredible as it is. Think about it, Pete said. Warner has never denied obtaining the manuscript. They may have used it exactly as DeVerley and Reback intended. He theorized that once Warner had the document, they could have rewritten the screenplay to eliminate any overlapping scenes. They knew DeVerley was going to sue, so they crafted the movie in a way that insulated themselves from potential legal trouble. The more I considered it, the more it made sense. Scene by scene, the movie diverged wildly from reality. Pacuz was never kidnapped with a gun to his head in the opening scene. DeVerley never fired a machine gun to intimidate drug dealers. Pacuz never lived in a high-rise apartment with his girlfriend, nor did he ever drive a Porsche, unless he was parking it for someone else, and neither did DeVerley. At the end, Pacuz never met Heinrich, nor was he ever handed a briefcase full of cash. Yet Warner's agents continued to promote the film as the unadulterated truth. Screenwriter Stephen Chin, in August 2016, claimed he was very interested in finding the real story. I saw these guys, Ephraim and David, as a way to tell an accessible story. As a way into the story about the war, I wanted to be deeply true to their story. During that same month, the real-life David Pacuz described the movie as exactly how it happened. On September 8, 2016, Todd Phillips promoted the film, stating, "Truth is stranger than fiction, and it was really the reality, the idea that it was a true story that appealed to me." He emphasized that, "We got this article, this Rolling Stone article. It's really about playing to the truth of it." Jonah Hill, during promotional appearances, made it clear that Warner marketed War Dogs as a true story. It's just a story that's so crazy you can't believe it actually happened. And it's all true. Warner understood that marketing War Dogs as a true story would attract more viewers. Phillips even admitted, "The idea that this was a true story was, for me, the most interesting part about it." Simply put, Warner knew it would make more money by presenting the film as a true story rather than a work of fiction. The Lanham Act states that a company cannot profit from knowingly marketing a product using false, misleading, or deceptive advertising, Pete said. According to Warner's own motion to dismiss the lawsuit, that's exactly what the company had done. It's potentially a mega settlement, worth tens of millions. It's a fucking scam, I replied. The book's fiction. They're running another scam. Plus, they're alleging deceptive and unfair trade practices, unfair competition. Pete continued. The lawsuit was legally sound, except for one glaring issue: the misrepresentation of Gun Runner's true nature. However, if I could prove that DeVerley and Reback had filed the copyright application solely to manufacture standing for a fraudulent lawsuit against Warner, they'd have unclean hands. Legally, at that point, you'd own the copyright. You'd have to join the suit and dispute ownership of the copyright. Without a doubt, DeVerley is a sharp guy. When he convinced me to write his story, he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew I didn't have the money to hire an intellectual property attorney, that the Bureau of Prisons' legal research system was severely limited, that fighting a civil case from behind bars was nearly impossible, and that I had nearly 2 decades left to serve. What he couldn't anticipate, however, was that I had no intention of serving my full sentence. The U.S. prosecutor in my criminal case, Gail McKenzie, had requested that I participate in interviews for tabloid programs like Dateline and American Greed. She also asked me to help write an ethics and fraud course, later used to train mortgage brokers nationwide. In exchange, she promised to request a reduction in my sentence. Despite fulfilling my end of the bargain, when it came time to file the motion, McKenzie refused. Within weeks, I consulted 2 criminal defense attorneys in Tampa. Both told me bluntly that there was nothing I could do to force the government to honor its promise. That's when I approached Frank Amadeo. I first took notice of Amadeo shortly after he arrived at the low-security prison in July 2009. Another inmate explained that the disbarred attorney suffered from extreme bipolar disorder with features of schizophrenia and had been declared legally incompetent. Yet his reputation preceded him. Before incarceration, Amadeo had attempted to defraud the federal government out of nearly $200 million. He invested in companies with military applications and even backed a failed political coup in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. As insane as it sounds, his goal was to take over the world. The federal government arrested him, pumped him full of antipsychotics, and sentenced him to over 20 years. True to his hypermanic nature, Amadeo organized from inside prison, the equivalent of a medium-sized law firm, employing only inmates as his staff. The megalomaniac and his minions cranked out motions for more than 100 incarcerated clients. Within minutes of hearing my story, Amadeo was indignant. "Don't worry," he told me. "I'm not going to let them get away with this." Amadeo and his associates spent nearly a year filing motions on my behalf. On October 8th, 2013, the court reduced my sentence from 26 years to 19. When I thanked him, I admitted that I had expected a slightly larger reduction. He just smirked like a man who had played the game and won. I snickered. Me too. I had nearly a decade left to serve. Amadeo nodded knowingly. "Looks like we're going to have to eat this elephant one spoonful at a time," he said. Ron Wilson was a gruff, old-school confidence man. He'd been sentenced to just under 20 years for running a decade-long Ponzi scheme, defrauding nearly 800 victims out of tens of millions. By the time I returned from court, Wilson had already been at Coleman Federal Correctional Complex for roughly a year. I used to walk the prison's half-mile track with Wilson sometimes. He was trying to reduce his sentence by assisting the U.S. Attorney's Office in prosecuting other fraudsters. "They're never going to cut my sentence," he grumbled. For months, he'd been fuming about the Secret Service agents who had investigated him. "The thing is, I've hidden Ponzi scheme money. Stop worrying," I assured him. If the government tried to withhold his reduction, I promised that Amadeo would force their hand. We walked in silence for a lap, the only sound being the crunch of gravel beneath our sneakers. Then Wilson turned to me and asked, "Can I trust you?" It was a strange question to ask a reputed con man. I gave him a sideways glance and replied, "Probably not." He chuckled, then admitted, "I put some money away." He revealed that he had entrusted roughly $500,000 of his Ponzi scheme proceeds to his soon-to-be ex-wife and his brother. A little over a month later, I mentioned it to my attorney. She contacted the lead Secret Service agent on Wilson's case. which resulted in the money being seized. Soon after, Wilson, his wife, and his brother were indicted. All pled guilty. Wilson's wife and brother received 1-year probation, and Wilson was sentenced to an additional 6 months. Amazingly, despite all this, my prosecutor again refused to reduce my sentence. I turned back to Amadeo, and after a relentless series of filings, he forced the government to act. This time, my sentence was reduced from 19 years to 14. Amadeo and his team had nearly cut my sentence in half, something DeVerley certainly hadn't counted on. The prison cafeteria was packed, serving pizza to the inmates. I sat at a table with 3 other guys when Pete rushed up to me. "There's a mediation," he gasped. "Warner, DeVerley, and Reback are going to settle." The parties were scheduled to meet on March 23rd, 2017, to mediate the claims. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Warner's caving. They want to discuss a settlement. If you don't intervene now, DeVerley and Reback are going to get settlement and disappear with the money." David Pacuz, the guy Miles Teller played in War Dogs, wanted to speak with me. Pacuz had been DeVerley's former business partner. He and another disgruntled partner, Ralph Merrill, were currently suing DeVerley over a contract dispute. Wedged between 2 inmates at the bank of stainless steel phone booths, I explained to him that DeVerley had run a bait-and-switch on me, bringing me in as a partner only to try and screw me out of our agreement. "Yeah," Pacuz said, "that's what he did to me over the Afghanistan contract. Pretty much his modus operandi." He asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed by his attorney and possibly deposed. DeVerley had been released from prison, published the book I had written, and was actively working to screw me out of my share. "Absolutely," I told him. "Bro, I'll do anything I can to help." Pacuz asked if DeVerley had ever confided in me about why he did it, why he had screwed him out of his end of the contract. During one of our many meetings on the recreation yard, I had asked DeVerley why he hadn't just paid Pacuz. He said he had an agreement with you, but once he started hiring employees, he realized he could hire someone for a lot less money. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked sourcing munitions for that contract? How many hours a day I put in? For weeks and weeks." Pacuz griped. "I work with him when no one else would. I get it. I admitted. I did the same thing. But he knew you didn't have anything in writing, and he was going to owe you millions by the end of the contract. He's going to screw you over too," Pacuz muttered. "Just wait." Using a 30-year-old Swintech typewriter with no word processing function, Pete began typing my motion to intervene in DeVerley and Reback's lawsuit against Warner. Days before the mediation, on March 14th, 2017, Pete and I filed the motion. Inside it, Pete exposed DeVerley and Reback's plan to manufacture a falsified lawsuit against Warner, though he didn't reveal the connection between Gunrunner and Stranger Danger. "Do you realize how devastating this motion is going to be to their case?" Pete asked. We locked eyes and burst into laughter. "Can you imagine?" I said. "I see DeVerley and Reback being led into Turkle's office by a hot little secretary. Turkle sits behind his desk, holds up the motion, and says, 'Devastating. Absolutely devastating.' DeVerley and Reback ask what he means, and he says, 'Your co-author, Matthew Cox, just snatched a $20 million settlement out of our hands.' You know, Turkle had to ask if the allegations were true," Pete said. "I know, right?" I replied. "That must have been an uncomfortable conversation." Turkle had to ask whether they had arranged for Shimmy to request a copy of the manuscript, knowing he was the son of a Warner Brothers executive. What a gut punch that must have been. Pete and I laughed again. Regardless of exactly how the conversation went between Turkle, DeVerley, and Reback, I know that on March 20th, my intervention caused Warner to cancel the scheduled mediation, permanently taking the mega settlement out of DeVerley, Reback, and Turkle's hands. After reviewing my claim, Warner's lawyers moved to depose me on June 20th, 2017. The studio stated, "Warner believes that Cox holds information important to our defense of DeVerley and Reback's remaining false advertising claims. Cox is a relevant witness. Thus, we seek to depose him. Because the judge hadn't ruled on my intervention yet, Pete fought the request. During the legal back and forth, I began emailing Warner's attorneys, Matthew Klein and Daniel Petroselli from O'Melveny and Myers. You do realize Petroselli is Trump's attorney, right?" Pete asked as we walked the prison's half-mile track in the Florida heat. He explained that the firm had over 700 attorneys. It's one of the largest, most prestigious law firms in the country. Their firm had thousands of years of combined experience and state-of-the-art legal resources, while Pete relied on a disbarred, legally incompetent lawyer and a 30-year-old beat-up Swintech typewriter. I said, "Can you imagine how disgusted they must be to communicate with us?" That night, I called my brother Mark. He told me he had spoken to our brother-in-law, Jack Townsend, about the lawsuit. Jack said the law firm DeVerley and Reback retained in Tampa is known for being ruthless. Mark admitted. "Seriously, the attorneys are vicious." "Vicious, huh?" I snorted. "One of my jailhouse lawyers ripped off the U.S. government for $200 million, then tried to take over the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The other is in here for murdering 2 federal informants and dumping their bodies in dumpsters. More vicious than that." Shortly after that call, given my allegations that I was the sole author and rights holder of the Gunrunner manuscript, and that DeVerley and Reback had conspired to steal my copyright, Warner's attorneys persuaded Judge Scriven that I possessed information that was important to Warner's defense and that I had documents and information relevant to Warner's case. As a result, the judge granted Warner permission to depose me at the prison. DeVerley and Reback knew that during the deposition, I would confirm the entire scheme to manufacture the lawsuit. With the collapse of their case imminent, they pushed for a second mediation scheduled for August 17th, 2017. I can't say for certain whether DeVerley, Reback, and their lawyers, Cohen and Turkle, were seated across the table from Klein and Petrocelli. I don't know if there were empty coffee cups or scattered papers, or if Reback had been negotiating fiercely for hours when he suffered a massive heart attack. I don't know whether he died on the conference room floor, in the ambulance, or hours later at the hospital. What I do know is that the following day, at 2:51 p.m., I received an email from my niece. "Jay, UST heard that Ross Reback died last night. My dad told me. We don't have any details yet. Just wanted to let you know." I was stunned. Although I had my grievances with Reback, I never wished him any harm. On the day of the funeral, well, over 100 mourners braved the Florida heat. Among them were my brother-in-law and my sister, Helen, sharing memories of Reback along with friends, family, and business associates. The confidence man prospers only because of the fundamental dishonesty of his victim, notes Dr. Maurer. A con man convinces the mark that he can earn a large sum of money dishonestly. As the lust for an easy profit is fanned into a flame, the mark sets aside all scruples. In the mad frenzy of cheating someone else, he is unaware that he is the real victim. You can't cheat an honest man. In November 2017, I received an email from DeVerley's attorney, Turkle, in Tampa. He informed me that he was no longer representing DeVerley and that DeVerley's new lawyer was Matthew Trockley. Days later, the federal court in Tampa notified me that DeVerley and Warner had mutually agreed to drop their lawsuit. To Pete and me, it appeared that Reback's death had prompted the parties to cut their losses. Pete tracked down Amadeo in his housing unit. They settled. The disbarred lawyer chuckled as he read the motion to dismiss. But the document didn't indicate any financial settlement. "How's that possible?" Pete asked. Warner knew there was a dispute over the copyright. If I were to win, I would have standing for relief, not DeVerley. This Reback must have convinced Warner to settle the suit before he died, Amadeo said. As it turned out, Warner and DeVerley simply dropped the lawsuit. Amadeo considered the factual allegations in my case for several seconds, then pieced it together. Because Warner promoted War Dogs as a true story to sell tickets, because movies marketed as true stories perform better, their advertising campaign caused damage to Cox by cutting him out of the marketplace. Consumers who wanted to know DeVerley's exploits were more likely to buy a ticket to War Dogs than purchase the Gunrunner book, causing loss of sales and credibility. That hasn't changed. Unlike Ephraim, Warner knows Cox may very well be the rightful copyright owner. It's in their best interest to settle with Ephraim and work to stop Cox. That way, they can continue marketing War Dogs as a true story. Amadeo added. They would have had to arrange for the settlement to be held in escrow until Cox was addressed. DeVerley must secure a ruling on copyright ownership. Only then will Warner release the funds. Keep in mind that Amadeo's assessment was only an educated guess. However, days later, DeVerley filed suit against me in the Southern District of Florida's federal court, seeking a judicial ruling on ownership of the copyright. On January 8, 2018, while Pete was drafting my countersuit, I called my sister, Helen, and asked if she had learned how Reback had died. "I think it was a heart attack," she said. Then she added that she and my brother-in-law had attended the funeral. You know, the nicest part of the service was when Jennifer, Reback's widow, told us that he had a great last day. He and a business partner had some big settlement in a lawsuit they'd filed against the studio. Ross was really excited about it. Name has been changed. Although my sister knew I was suing Reback, DeVerley, and Warner, she had no idea she was revealing anything of real significance. Yet her words confirmed that Warner had indeed settled with DeVerley and Reback. Minutes later, I relayed the call to Pete. We immediately contacted Amadeo. The disbarred attorney paused, considering the case, then finally said, $5 million. He got Warner for at least $5 million. My release date was set for July 2019. However, in early 2018, my case manager informed me that I would likely be leaving for a halfway house by the end of the year. That night, Pete and I sat in the prison library, going over example after example of scenes I had taken directly from Stranger Danger, as well as scenes that had inspired portions of Gunrunner. I pointed out characters and nearly identical dialogue I had used to create the manuscript that DeVerley and Reback had presented in court as DeVerley's true story. Roughly an hour later, as we walked back to Pete's housing unit, I mentioned that it was very likely DeVerley and Reback had misled their lawyers into believing my claims were baseless. "You know what we ought to do," Pete said. "We should send Tranquil a few pages of Stranger Danger alongside the corresponding pages in Gunrunner." He explained that if DeVerley had misled his counsel, Tranquil would have to remove himself immediately. He can't go into court and take a position that he knows is a lie. "You want to get his lawyer to quit?" I asked. At this point, Pete chuckled. "We want to make this case as difficult and expensive as possible for DeVerley. Forcing his attorney to quit will definitely throw a wrench in the machinery." Tranquil received the priority package containing the examples proving the fictionalization of Gunrunner on July 18, 2018. 9 days later, he sent me an email stating that he was withdrawing as DeVerley's counsel. The most likely explanation was that Tranquil, after reviewing the Stranger Danger samples, realized that his client had misled him and that the case was far less winnable than he had been led to believe. Regardless of the specifics, DeVerley promptly hired Ryan Clancy, a prominent attorney out of Miami, to replace Tranquil. Of course, I immediately mailed Clancy a copy of Stranger Danger, but it had no effect, indicating that DeVerley had likely told him at least some version of the truth. I began trading emails with Clancy regarding my countersuit, which now included Warner and Reback's estate. As the exchange intensified, Warner's attorney, Klein, began emailing me as well. Over the next several weeks, the two lawyers unleashed a barrage of messages, each seemingly designed to pressure me into settling. "We are prepared to offer you the sum that has been budgeted to defend against these claims," Clancy wrote. He explained that the amount would deplete with each email sent. Warning: "At this rate, I think you're going to end up with nothing but attorney fees against you." I responded firmly. Warner itself had conceded in its motion to dismiss DeVerley and Reback's first amended complaint that War Dogs was largely fictionalized. That, I pointed out, was not what Warner's advertising had led the public to believe. Moreover, I had alerted Klein that DeVerley and Reback were committing a fraud on the court, and that I had proof of it. I wrote, "Notwithstanding these facts, Warner chose to pay DeVerley. By paying him off, Warner is now in a position to continue deceiving the public into believing that War Dogs is a true story. A blatant violation of the Lanham Act. Despite my willingness to discuss settlement, DeVerley's attorney never made a reasonable offer. A confidence man, once he has established himself, seldom changes his profession for another in the underworld," Dr. Maurer explains. The con man moves from one confidence game to the next. So long as they're marks with money, the law will find great difficulty in suppressing confidence games. In early September 2018, Pete, while researching civil conspiracy law, stumbled across multiple lawsuits in which DeVerley, after extracting a settlement from Warner, had turned around and sued Simon & Schuster, Google, NBC Universal, Apple, Amazon.com, Rolling Stone, Guy Lawson, Hulu, and CNBC LLC. These lawsuits asserted the same claims he had alleged in the Warner case, the very claims he had previously admitted lacked merit. That night, Pete and I walked the prison compound, discussing DeVerley's newest lawsuits. "It makes perfect sense," I said. "He's perfected the scam, and now he's duplicating it. He must think Clancy's going to be able to get the cases dismissed," Pete replied. We realized that because we had not informed the court of the specific nature of DeVerley and Reback's fraud. Stranger danger. DeVerley likely believed the attorneys for his most recent targets would never discover that he was using a fabricated book to extort settlements. "I think we should notify every single one of the defendant's attorneys about what DeVerley is doing. It'll devastate his case," I concluded. "If DeVerley isn't going to make me a reasonable offer," I replied, "I'm more than willing to crush any chance he has of continuing his scam." It only seemed fair. Pete spent several days drafting a lengthy email on my behalf. It introduced who I was, gave background on the case, and established my claim as the true copyright owner. But the heart of the email hammered home the fraud DeVerley was committing against his clients. "Your client is a victim of a scheme hatched by DeVerley and Reback, while DeVerley was still serving his prison sentence at the Coleman Federal Correctional Complex for defrauding the United States," Pete wrote. The email explained that I was the author of a novel titled Stranger Danger, which, along with Gunrunner, is relevant to your lawsuit. Notably, Stranger Danger is entirely a work of fiction. I recounted being present during the meetings where Reback and DeVerley conceived their scheme. The very one seems to have taken at face value that the Gunrunner memoir tells DeVerley's true story, i.e., that the book presents a factually accurate version of DeVerley's exploits. That's the foundational fraud in IE's scheme. In reality, entire passages in DeVerley's memoir are literally taken word for word from the Stranger Danger manuscript. There are also numerous scenes in Gunrunner based on scenes I invented for Stranger Danger. I closed the email. I did not write the Gunrunner manuscript so that it could be used to engage in criminal conduct or serve as a basis for fraudulent lawsuits. Nor did I write it to be used in a scheme to abuse judicial process by engaging in serial fraud on the court. When Clancy learned that I had contacted DeVerley's potential targets, he fired off a scathing email. In it, he claimed that by contacting the defendant's attorneys, I was only jeopardizing any potential future settlement. What Clancy didn't mention was the chaos my email had unleashed. It was so devastating to DeVerley's case that on November 5th, 2018, Clancy moved to postpone a scheduled mediation while he scrambled to regroup. "That you're not going to believe this," Pete yelled from across the compound. He was grinning. His mother had emailed him the court docket. The email blew up DeVerley's mediation. A rush of satisfaction hit me. I pictured Clancy and DeVerley screaming at one another in frustration in their office. Millions, if not tens of millions, had been snatched from their grasp. Within the hour, we updated Amadeo on the situation. He pondered the news for a few seconds and muttered, "That was a crippling blow to their case. It wouldn't surprise me if they settled the lawsuit within a month." "What do you think he'll get?" Pete asked. "A few $100,000, Amadeo replied. "If that." On November 30th, the court issued an order indicating that Simon & Schuster, Google, NBC Universal, Apple, Amazon.com, Rolling Stone, Guy Lawson, Hulu, and CNBC LLC had settled with DeVerley. I later discovered that DeVerley's multi-million-dollar lawsuit had been so damaged that he was forced to accept only a fraction of what he had demanded. The night before I left for the halfway house, Pete and I walked the prison compound. Inmates I've been friendly with wished me luck and advised me to stay out of trouble. A typical prisoner farewell. Once you get situated, Pete said, start calling intellectual property attorneys. It's not going to be easy. Unlike personal injury cases, which often settle in less than 18 months, IP cases can take over 5 years to reach conclusion. That means IP attorneys rarely take cases on contingency. They can't afford to defer fees and costs for years while waiting for a positive verdict. It's the primary reason these big studios get away with stealing artists' IP. People like you can't afford to fight them. I know. Pete, I said. Pete went on and on about the strength of my case, but all I could think about was how much I was going to miss him. It's going to take a ton of calls, he grinned, but you're a con man, you'll find someone. 2 pairs of sweatpants and 4 t-shirts was all I had when I arrived at the Tampa halfway house. Within days, I began calling intellectual property attorneys in Tampa and Miami, dozens of them. Every single one wanted a $50,000 retainer. Eventually, I connected with Francis Malafy, a Philadelphia-based attorney whom Philadelphia Magazine described as a rash, chain-smoking punk rocker with a switchblade-sharp legal mind. Fran's firm had successfully sued multiple hip-hop artists, including Usher, and he had just won a $44 million verdict, the largest in Pennsylvania, over the song Bad Girl. At the time, he was embroiled in a protracted legal battle with Led Zeppelin over Stairway to Heaven. At first, Fran wasn't interested in taking the case on contingency. "You've got to give me something," he said. "I can't go to trial without a retainer. The government took all my money," I replied. "Besides, this isn't going to trial. DeVerily wants to settle. It's a slam dunk." Overwhelmed with cases, Fran handed me off to A.J. Fleur, a bookish associate at his firm who radiated calm professionalism, someone you trust to do your taxes. 2 days later, A.J. called. He would take the case. "I'll be counsel of record," he said. "Fran can't assist." The halfway house released me after 7 months. I'd managed to buy an old, beat-up Jeep Liberty, but not enough for my own place. I ended up renting a friend's spare room. "We have a mediation scheduled in Miami," Fran said during a September call. "Clancy, DeVerley's attorney, wants to do it on the 12th. It's a 4-hour drive both ways," I protested. "My Jeep will never make it." Miami's Brickell district gleamed with stylish skyscrapers and curated professionals. It was like Manhattan, only with better weather. I met Fran and AJ at One Biscayne Tower. Around the conference table, DeVerley's attorney, Clancy, radiated the entitled charm of a frat boy. I can't disclose exactly what was said, but there was no real movement on either party's demands. I was just leaving the city limits when AJ called. "Turn around," he said. "Meet us at the Pink Pony." "That's a strip club?" I asked. Clancy called. He explained. "DeVerley wants to talk." By 10 o'clock, I stepped into the club. Fran, clearly enjoying himself, was perched at the bar with AJ, surrounded by several strippers. Over the next hour, Fran went from sliding 20s into garters to spanking 2 dancers at a time. When DeVerley and Clancy arrived, Fran was being escorted to a cab by the manager, a couple of security guards, and AJ. As they were leaving, AJ told DeVerley the meeting wasn't happening, but DeVerley didn't leave. I finished my soda and started toward the exit when he stopped me. 2 minutes, he pleaded. "That's all I need." We sat at a small table, encircled by strippers and patrons, while Clancy kept his distance. "I have a 4-hour drive back to Tampa," I shouted over the music. "So if you have something to say, say it." DeVerley began by claiming my intervention had cost me tens of millions. "All you and Ross had to do was pay me what was owed," I said. "But you two never intended to." I shot him an evil grin and snickered. "Bet you never thought you'd see me again?" DeVerley's lips tightened. He claimed the stress of my intervention caused Reback's heart attack. "We were looking at a $40 million payday, and you fucked it up," he hissed. "You might as well have stuck a Glock to his chest and pulled the trigger." "You can't be serious," I said, locking eyes with him. "I'm not going to feel bad for the guy who was trying to fuck me over. Guilt is what killed him, not me." DeVerley sneered, but it was an act. I could see the tension ebb as he shifted tactics. He leaned in closer, pretending to confide, claiming he missed our friendship, as if it had ever been real. I grinned at the clumsy attempt that he admitted that, just as Pete and I had ruined his case against Warner, my email to Simon & Schuster, Google, NBC Universal, Apple, Amazon.com, Rolling Stone, Guy Lawson, Hulu, and CNBC LLC had also decimated that case. "Probably cost me a $20 million settlement," he said. I grinned back. Imagine what I could have done if I hadn't been locked up. I had been at a severe disadvantage until then. "So, how do you get this lawyer?" he asked. DeVerley knew I couldn't afford someone like Fran. What's he costing you? He hasn't cost me a dime, I replied. He's confident in the case, so I got him on contingency. I rattled off Fran's accomplishments. The guy's a beast. Why are you getting all in your feelings about this? Spat DeVerley. It's not personal, it's business. That's the problem, Ephraim, I said. For me, it is personal. Prison had changed me. Money wasn't the only path to happiness anymore. I had found purpose in writing. I was happier in prison writing those stories than I've ever been in my life. And you stole that from me. You and Ross took the only honest thing I've ever done and turned it into a fucking scam. He blurted out, "Do you have any fucking idea how much money your lawsuit has cost me in legal fees alone?" He gave me a once-over and sneered. "Do you really think I'm going to hand over millions of dollars to you? You know what I've spent so far? About 200 mackerel." DeVerley winced at the thought that I had waged a drawn-out legal battle from prison for the equivalent of $200. I explained that Pete, a drug dealer incarcerated for murdering 2 FBI informants, and his associates, including a disbarred attorney, had helped me fight the case for free. The only person I paid was the guy making copies for me. "You cost me over $100,000. I am resourceful." I cut him off. "It's not about the money, right? I live in a rooming house for next to nothing." I made it clear that even if I won, money wouldn't change my life. Even if I end up with a few million, it won't change anything. A bigger place to live and a nicer car won't change anything. I'm already happy. I write every day, and that's enough. Then why sue me? Because I know the money means everything to you. I level my gaze at him. DeVerley and Reback could have honored their obligations by publishing the book, selling the life rights, or working with production companies interested in Once a Gun Runner. Instead, they chose to use the manuscript to manufacture lawsuits. In the process, you 2 greedy fuckers cut my throat. Bro, it wasn't personal. It's about to be, I spat. My stomach churned at the thought of how they had profited from a scheme. I pointed toward the door where AJ and Fran had just exited. "I'm willing to spend every last fucking dime of Francis Malafy's money to make sure you get as little as possible from this lawsuit." Repulsed, DeVerley pulled back slightly. The idea that money meant nothing to me clearly sickened him. My only concern was stripping him of as much of his illicit gains as I could by any legal means at my disposal. He began blurting out numbers. When he finally hit an amount I was willing to accept, I stood abruptly and walked out of the club. I can't tell you precisely what the final settlement came to, but I can say this. DeVerley was miserable having to part with the cash. Months after I deposited DeVerley's check, Pete called from prison. "What are you working on?" he asked. "I just finished It's Insanity," I replied. The story is based on Frank Amadeo's case, and I was in the process of self-publishing it. I went on, explaining that I've been thinking more about the events surrounding the dude. Where's my hand grenade? Lawsuit, as Pete and I had come to call it. It's kind of interesting if you think about it. The characters, Jonah Hill, Bradley Cooper, Todd Phillips, Warner Brothers. The scheme, the players, the marks, the double crosses. It's a great fucking story. It's not bad, Pete admitted, but it's no War Dogs.